giving you the context of what we are in. The whole workshop has been under the idea of the future of the German model, which has been very much linked to a research project, some research projects where we started last year to commission studies on main basic big challenges for Germany. Indeed, in the end, something like the big challenges of our times for any country, but in that special research project, we wanted to dig deeper into what this all means for Germany and for the German model, and that made, and in the end, we had the idea to make a whole workshop and to present each of these studies. So we had a study, the second phase of a study of a research project on inequality, where we, in the first phase, that's what we presented last year, tried to have an empirical update on what is the state, because it's not so easy, the statistics aren't easy, of inequality in Germany. The second state was what we have presented, and Charlotte Martels has presented yesterday, on the drivers of inequality in Germany, because for our project in the 3 steps, this is the important one, to understand where inequality comes from, and in the third phase, then be better able to define what are the best and most efficient instruments to get against inequality. We had a discussion about industrial policy, which is very much linked to the challenge of climate change and anyway the change of industrial structures in Germany, which may hit Germany especially, and where we had an excellent study done by the team of Mariana Mazzucato on industrial policy. We have had a study by Michael Hüter and Jens Südekom on fiscal policy, questioning the current rules and proposing some new ideas for reform of the debt brake to better cope with underinvestment, public investment, and difficulties of municipalities. And we had a study presented on the German export surplus, which is more or less the question of how can Germany become an economy that is less dependent on exports in a way. That was the core of the studies that we have presented, and then we had some excellent contributions. We had a more political day on Monday with interventions of the SPD, had invited Walter Boyans, a political panel with also Dalia Marin with an excellent presentation on also the let's say the experience of Germany after unification and what that means for the reform of capitalism. And we had to talk with Jens Spahn, the German Minister of Health. Yesterday there was another talk, a keynote by Thomas Piketty on the German ideology and the renovation of Europe, with an excellent discussion afterwards on that we may come back to later this morning when we are talking about Germany's future role in the Eurozone. And we had yesterday in the afternoon another highlight at the end with a talk between Joe Stieglitz and Olaf Scholz, German Minister of Finance, who yesterday just had introduced his budget plans in the Bundestag. And I mean, having taken the time to come and discuss with Joe Stieglitz is something I think we should appreciate, whatever we think about what he said. But it was a nice talk. I mean, Joe was friendly, I think, that's for sure. But maybe also due to the fact that even Joe Stieglitz is not does not have all the days the opportunity to talk to a current Minister of Finance of such a big country, or important country like Germany. I think in the end we have a lot of people from different boards, and I think I don't want to construct whatever consensus, but I think there's something like a dynamic understanding that there are some big challenges for Germany, and there is a need to find new solutions. That's what our project is about, to search or to help and search for a new paradigm. And to see what are the new answers. And anyway, in the discussions, we see that it's a new kind of a discussion. That's what I'm very proud of, that we avoid the old economic debates and battles. And I want it, and that's what I think succeeded in doing, to be very productive on new ideas, like on inequality, where it's a lot about understanding what's happening. And that leads to our today third day and a half day that we have, and with another couple of highlights, where now we want to discuss on the future, let's say, the future of the German model in under the with the question of populism, which is, I mean, in a way, touching everything that we had yesterday, because depending, and that's something we want to discuss in this panel, on the interpretation of the reasons for populism, there are indications that it's also at least linked to socioeconomic factors, that a lot of what's happening in industries has contributed, the disruptions in industries like in the US, in the Rust Belt and so on, has contributed to populism. And that this is an important link, and that for us, the question of the future of, let's say, the prospects of populism and in Germany, AfD, is very much also a question of how the German model will evolve. We don't want, and we hopefully won't have something like the debate in the US yesterday in whatever, a year or so, or 4 years then. But the question is open. I mean, populism has also hit Germany, and the AfD has been strong for some time. This year, the big news is maybe in that sense that the corona crisis doesn't seem to have helped populists in any country, but also in Germany, if you look at the polls for the AfD. So one of the leading questions now is the time over? Is the time for populism over, at least for Germany? There has been a study recently published by, I think, Bertelsmann and others, saying that in polls you see less populist attitudes by Germans than some time ago. Is that for real? Is that something which we can count on, or will there be another wave, or may there be another wave of populism? This is very much linked to the. I mean, the answer is very much linked to the fundamental analysis we are having for what is the reason for populism. So I want to kick off this discussion saying that we are having two other highlights this morning: a presentation on the ups and downs of buzzwords, neoliberal, market liberal buzzwords in Germany. That's very exciting. You should have a look at that. And then an excellent, huge session on the future role of Germany in the Eurozone, with people like Clemens Fuß, Martin Wolf, and moderated by Mark Fieritz from Die Zeit. So stay tuned then afterwards. But now let's kick off. I want to ask Robert to kick off, because you've been doing a lot of academic work on the reasons, on the drivers of populism internationally, but also in Germany. What is your latest understanding of what's happening? And maybe also a first element to answer the question is populism over? Will there be another? May there be another wave in the run up to the next year's elections in Germany?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction. I always refrain a little bit from looking at populism in Germany in isolation. So I'm very much used to looking at populism in Germany as part of a European trend, or you could even count the US in. And there you see that over the last decade or so, we have an increasing trend towards populist support in many countries. And I think the studies around that have looked into the reasons for that, they came up with a variety of drivers of that, of course. But one consistent picture is that economic shocks and the inequalities that result from global economic developments, increasing international trade, automatization, also the financial crisis have contributed to the rise of populism. Specifically, they have increased the demand for protectionist and nationalist policies. And what we see is that specifically right-wing populist parties very successfully tap into this voting potential. And in Germany, it's the AfD that have tapped into this potential. Indeed, I think that let me as long as these inequalities persist, as long as there's losers from international economic developments, there's a voting potential for parties that offer nationalist, isolationist, or protectionist policies. Whether this is populist parties, like in Central Europe, or whether that is a mainstream party, like in the UK, the Tories, in the end doesn't matter. What the core issue is this voting potential. And this is there to persist as long as these inequalities persist. If you ask me about Germany concretely, I think what's a little bit specific is two things. The one is that in international comparison, Germany has always been a winner of globalization, and thus we have been a relative latecomer in this populist movement. And I think this is partly also due to the German economic model, with a relatively strong welfare state, with as compared to Anglo-Saxon countries, rather interventionist policies, but also from our export orientation, where many people benefit from the global development. And the AfD grew strong on an anti-immigration platform. That's pretty obvious. And the AfD has not managed to broaden its scope or to develop a consistent agenda beyond that. And with the Corona crisis, the migration topic has lost its prominence. And I think you also see that populists in power don't perform that well. So I do indeed think that the high times of the AfD might be over, as long as they do not manage to bring this migration topic up again. But it's different in many other European countries, where populism has transcended into the mainstream, and where more policy areas are discussed in this populist way, with ignorance of facts and on the basis of ideological issues. And thus, I think, even if the AfD loses support in the next general election, first, the voting potential for nationalist policy approaches persist, as long as the underlying economic fundamentals persist. And an economic model like the German economic model, that strongly rests on an open economy and is grounded in the European Union, cannot successfully develop if this European trend persists. So we don't gain much if the AfD loses ground, but this populist rhetorics persists in other European countries, because I think this very way, we saw this yesterday in the debate in the US, this very way of doing politics, the populist way, erodes the basis for international cooperation. And thus, I think even in Germany, we must not focus on the AfD and the populists in Germany only. It's a European phenomenon, and voting in other countries also matters for us. This is what I wanted to say here.
Thank you, Robert. I hand over to Anke Hassel, who's leading the WSI. You've done a lot of research on these issues also. So please, what is your take on the prospects of populism, and especially the German situation currently and the next few months?
Yes, thank you, Thomas, and thank you, first of all, for inviting me here to this panel and for this great conference you put up. I think it is outstanding. Your program is really outstanding. When it comes to the future of populism in Germany, under the impact of the pandemic, you have already correctly described that the AfD is not doing so well in the polls, and that this might give us hope that the height of populism in Germany is actually over. I would not be so optimistic, and I would not share this analysis. And for the same reason as Robert has just said, that the fundamentals, the underlying fundamentals, the conflicts on which populism thrives, these conflicts have not been resolved. And one could even turn it around and say what we will see in the course of the pandemic and in the economic impact, the long-term economic impact of the pandemic and of other aspects of structural change on the German economy might lead to more economic insecurities, to more social inequalities, which might drive more populist fears in the population and therefore give more voting potential for the far right. And if we look at what is happening now, we have the combination, the coincidence of the pandemic in a situation where the German manufacturing sector was already under pressure and in a lot of stress. And if we look at how many people are on short-term work in Germany, we see it is not actually the service economy which is hit hardest or which uses short-term work the most. We see that it is the manufacturing sector in the previously relatively affluent areas of Germany, which is using a lot of short-time work, which means they are shielding their workers from layoffs, which they would otherwise have to implement. And these layoffs are only partly to do with the pandemic. These layoffs are to do with climate change. They are to do with the decline of the combustion engine, with the restructuring in many areas of the manufacturing industries. And what we do know today already is that a lot of these jobs will be lost. And these are relatively highly paid jobs in the manufacturing sectors in areas where people thought they were protected from structural change and economic change. And this goes hand in hand with more economic insecurity, and this will feed into an expectation of people that the government should do something in order to protect them. And if the government does not deliver the protection, this will lead to more frustration and might lead to a new rise in populism just on socioeconomic grounds. So I think in the medium to long term, we might have more worries to worry about voting potential for the far right. And similarly, we can also say that for more issues of identity politics, for diverse and open societies, because again, here we have a coincidence of the pandemic on one hand, and at the same time, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, we have anti-racism debate, we have a lot of debate about diversity in German society. We have now for the first time after, maybe not for the first time, but now we have after 30 years of German reunification, we have a much more substantial debate about socioeconomic inequalities between East Germans and West Germans. We know that East Germans have far fewer assets than compared to West Germans. We know that their incomes are still not equal compared to West Germans. So we have a lot of reasons where it might get more social conflicts between regions, but also between different groups in society, which then might feed again the voting potential for the far right, because the white male lower middle classes might feel threatened by a further discussion about anti-racism, a further discussion about anti-discrimination, and might look for political alternatives in order to deal with that. And the third aspect, which I also want to bring into the mix, is really the political aspect. So we are 1 year ahead of a German general election. We have on the left, we have Olaf Scholz as a chancellor candidate of the SPD. But on the side of the CDU, there is a lot of confusion still, and we do not know who will replace Angela Merkel. I think it is a safe bet that the CDU will come out as the winning party out of the election, but we do not know who will lead Angela Merkel. And we have seen in recent polls that people are really undecided on who they will vote for, depending on who will succeed Angela Merkel. And that can create a lot of political instability and political insecurity. And people might abstain, or people might go for alternatives for which they, at the moment, in the current situations, not opt for. So I think there are a lot of underlying reasons why we should worry about the far right, even in Germany, even though we know that comparatively speaking, in the European context, but in particular also in context compared to the United States, populism is now at the moment not our main concern, but I think we should still take it seriously and expect there will be more to come in the future, in the next 12 months, that we have to take care of. So finally, when we deal with populism, and the question is always, how do we deal with populism? I think we need to distinguish between the voters' potential and the people who are worried for socioeconomic reasons, but also for cultural and identity reasons, but also for political reasons, and how we should distinguish those, the voters, from the party, the AfD, and we should have separate approaches how we deal with the AfD on the one hand and how we deal with voters on the other hand. And this debate has already been happening over the last couple of years, that people have said we really have to take worry seriously. We have to have policies, industrial policy, employment policy, structural change policies in order to help people who fear of losing their jobs in structural change. We have to address socioeconomic inequalities to help those people. And we also have to embrace, in a discussion about the open society, about diversity, how can we deal with diversity and how can we deal with anti-discrimination and the fear of losing out. I think we have to have very clear policies on these issues. But we also have to have very clear policies on the AfD, because if you look at what the political science literature sort of says about populism, and if you look at books like the book, for instance, by Daniel Sieblatt and Levitsky about how democracies die, we know from research is that democracies die when centrist parties start operating or tacitly supporting or at least tolerating the far right getting into power positions in political systems. And we also know that as soon as the far right is in a power position, they will start changing the institutions, eroding the institutions, ignoring the institutions, and ignoring the rule of law. And that is what is happening in Hungary and Poland, but it's also to some extent happening in the United States and a little bit in the United Kingdom. So I think there we also need to have a very clear position and a very clear approach that it is absolutely fundamental that centrist parties, center-right and center-left, do not start cooperating and tolerating the far right when they try to get into power positions. And that we have seen that over the last 12 months in a number of cases. And I think it is absolutely essential that we make this position very clear.
Thank you very much, Anke. Very clear, very Gustav Horn, who has been director and founder of the EMK Institute in Düsseldorf, and now advising the SPD, and especially having written and published a book very recently on the reasons for post-populism, right-wing populism, which is called Gegensteuern. The title of the book, which is very inspiring. So you're a very good place. You've thought a lot about this question. Is your take more or less the same as the others? First, perhaps on the diagnosis and the prospects of populism in Germany.
First of all, thank you for having me here at this really outstanding conference. I looked at the program and learned a lot. So what about populism? I think populism is a sort of pandemic. As we have heard by Robert already, it's infectious. If populism spreads in one country and, for example, protectionist policies are applied there, certainly other countries have to react on that and probably apply the same measures. So we have a kind of infection here. But there are times when you are more resilient against these infections and times where you're more weak. At the moment, I think at this time, we are more resilient against it because we're still in a deep crisis caused by the pandemic. And the government is doing a lot to protect people against the economic impacts of that crisis. And people feel that, and the approval ratings of government are pretty high, much higher than they were before. But at the times, and that's what Anke and Robert already said, this crisis is over. It really depends what happens next. And For example, if the debate shifts to the topic, who will pay for all this debt burden we are uploading right now, then we have a debate which might cause fear by some people. And this is a key word in all, at the root of the populism. It's fear. The roots of the AfD, for example, was not an anti-migrant policy, but rather an anti-euro policy at the times of the euro crisis, where the euro became very insecure and the construction of the eurozone became very insecure. That was the time when the AfD was founded by an economist, by the way. And that was the first step of the AfD. Then came anti-migrantism, and it shifted to the climate change. And as I like to add in political in the political scenery, I say, and then there came the wolves to my region of Brandenburg, and they also caused fear. And that's all topics with fear, connect with fear, where these populists are certainly, which is a very beneficiary environment for populists, because it's not only that they address the losers of change, they address all people who are afraid of change. And because we have not a very weak correlation between income and voting behavior, but it's rather that people are afraid of losing control of their lives. And they still have a very decent income, even sometimes a high income. Nevertheless, they vote for the populist. And we see that in the United States, we have seen that in Germany too. But there is fear in these people, and the fear of losing control of their lives, of their economic performance, and so on. And that has to be addressed by politics. And Anke already mentioned a lot of fields of politics which are necessary which have to address these issues. We have to give people good reasons to see that the government is doing something for them, to protect them for adverse impacts, for example, of this pandemic. That's exactly what's happening right now. But also we have to do that after this crisis. And for example, this speaks strongly against the policy of austerity to reduce the debt burden after the crisis. Because in that case, for example, with cuts in the social system, we will certainly raise this fear again, and that will raise populism again. And also it certainly will be a very important debate, who is going to pay for all the interest burden which has been rising up, and will we reintroduce a wealth tax, for example? Will we increase heritage tax, or will we just cut into the social system? And these are very decisive questions. If the latter happens, I'm absolutely convinced that populism in Germany will rise again, and in other countries too, and maybe in a kind of different institutional setting. What we have seen in recent months already is that the AfD is trying at least to expand their base towards people who were very skeptical towards this crisis right from the beginning here. Anti-vaccination people and so on, people who from the beginning said the virus is not very dangerous. It's an imagination of Bill Gates to produce vaccines and so on. All this stuff will come up. Maybe there are new coalitions in the making, and that certainly we have to take care of, and policy has to take care of in the next year or two.
Thank you very much, Gustav. So I think we need to diagnose that to do the diagnosis that we have a panel that is not very much in disaccord on fundamental question, but I don't think that it's a big problem, because when you want to discuss in a productive and constructive way, it's not always helpful to have very diverging views. And I think we have a lot of questions that are interesting in deeper terms. But I would like to ask Robert, we all seem to share this this diagnosis that there's something about fear, loss of control, socioeconomic factors, disruptions that explains, and that's what I understand from your research. But very openly, and you're an academic, you need to be very neutral. How is the state of academic research? In political debates, you always find people who say, well, finally, it's not economic, it's in its culture. So could you give us an idea how disputed this question still is? It's a quite recent research field in academics.
Well, sure. I mean, there's a, well, how to put it? Yeah, there's a very fundamental debate in the end, I think, between political science and econ, whether culture is more important in explaining not only populist voting, it's even older, right fringe voting, or whether it's economics. I think the empirical evidence from both fields indicate that it is both. So you have strong level differences between countries in whether populist parties manage to even enter the government, or whether they remain minority parties like in Germany with 10%. You have strong regional differences. That's very interesting to see in Germany, that do relate to cultural issues, that you still have Catholic milieus where people traditionally vote for the CDU and do not accept that democratic parties right of the CDU could ever exist. And you have other regions where people are more willing to also try out fringe parties and all this stuff. That's of course there. And this topic-wise, there is, of course, what Anke Hassel said, that there is this identity issues, that specific social group, white men of medium age with traditional values, fear losing their identity in a society that develops into a more open, multicultural development. Of course, this is all there, but this does not contradict the very factor that people are responsive to economic shocks. The question is, from economic perspective, I think economic research is more interested in the trend, not so much in the level differences. Why are the populists strong in the one region but not in the other? Economic research very much is into what drives the increase. Why do people change their voting behavior? And there it's obvious that people, if they face economic shocks. And interestingly, and I'm with Gustav Horn here, it's not so much, this is what our research clearly shows, that people individually have lost their job because their jobs have been outsourced. People are much more responsive to the economic development of the whole region. So even if they themselves are not affected at all by economic developments, if the region is in decline, this raises anxieties about the future and make people susceptible for this populist campaigning. And I think both, that's if you ask me about the state of the research, a lot of research now looks in exactly those interactions. So why is it that those regions that are in economic downturn, why is it that people there are so supportive of populist and nationalist policies? And this interacts with these issues. So I think both factors do not contradict each other. They go in hand. And specifically, there's also a supply side, and there you have to say that populist parties are particularly successful in addressing these fears and in providing a narrative that links economic hardship to anxieties, to identity issues, and provide a policy or promise a policy that is attractive to those exposed, and which is then a mixture of providing protection on the economic side, but also of promising more homogeneous cultural development for the future. I think this is my take from the current research, specifically from the empirical research on the issue.
This, by the way, a very interesting paper by Danny Roderick, published recently, who's exploring or trying in a very modest, decent way to explore this difficulty to identify the the core reasons and what is the second round effects in a way, and what you call supply, so that there are some parties. The core reasons may be different, maybe economic, but then parties exploit this fact in introducing whatever narratives or things to people that it's about immigration or whatever. Anke, is that your take also much that this is the state of the discussion, or what would you say is on the reasons of populism? Is there something which is more or less established today as a consensus?
I think what is established, if we just empirically, is that the average right-wing voter, far right-wing voter, is not the poorest voter. So, and in many analysis, we see that they have the average AfD voter has an average, above average pay, for instance, and above average wealth situation. So it's not really the working classes. And, we discussed in the beginning of, of analyzing the AfD and the success of the AfD, we focused a lot on the lower middle, on the poor people in society, and thought this is a phenomenon that poor people sort of hit back against the establishment. But we know it is not the poorest part of the of society who vote for the far right. We know it is more middle class people, and it is precisely because they have a lot to lose. I mean, people who do not have much to lose, they either not vote at all, or they vote on the left, or they vote even just mainstream conservative. But it is really people who have middle class positions and who have an economic position to lose, who go for the far right, and because they fear that they are not protected by current government policies against negative impacts of structural changes, and we know that there is an effect of that. In the political science literature, we have a long-standing discussion about cleavages that leads to voting decisions, and we have for a very long time have two dimensions, and one is the socioeconomic dimension, and that is the classic left-right dimension, which divides the party spectrum between people on the left and the right. One's more interested in redistribution and social equality, and one more interested in growth and liberal policies. But now, but also for at least 3 decades, we have a discussion about the second dimension, and the second dimension is on cultural orientations, and that is really divides the society between open and closed societies, or multicultural societies, or homogeneous societies. And the analysis there has focused recently really on when you sort of map out party systems, and that you find a movement within the party system of the more center-right parties who used to favor on the cultural dimension, who used to be much more clearly in the camp of protecting closed societies and being against multicultural societies. If you think back, the CDU 10 years ago, it was not in favor of immigration, very clearly not in favor of immigration, and we had even election campaigns, regional election campaigns where representatives of the CDU said we want our own population policies, we want to have higher birth rates of Germans, and we don't want immigration. And in 2015, when we had an influx of a large number of refugees, this hit the CDU as a party hard, because all of a sudden the whole position on immigration and the stance on immigration just was lost and abandoned by Angela Merkel overnight, so to speak, because then in the aftermath of that, we had more of a discussion also of the CDU embracing immigration and dealing more constructively or openly with immigration. The effect is that we now, in the political party spectrum, we have no political party anymore who is really conservative in the sense that on the cultural and value basis, they opt for a more closed society. And the AfD is the only party in the party spectrum which has the position that they are in favor of a more closed society and are not really promoting an open society. And that just leaves an open a gap in the political competition, because all other parties are in favor of open societies, they have more positive views on immigration. They have moved along on gay rights, LGBT rights, a whole set of postmodernist identity politics rights. And there is still a segment in society which doesn't go along with that, and which is much more conservative, culturally conservative, and does not have a home anymore. And that is a discussion, if you think back a year ago or 2 years ago, when in Die Linke there was a discussion with Sarah Wagenknecht, who said, we really, as a left-wing party, we have to adopt a position which is much more in favor of closed societies, and also has a much more anti-globalization stance, but also a stance which has a sort of view of controlled migration, and we have to reduce migration to some extent, or at least we have to look at it very carefully. So in the party spectrum, the AfD has an open space there, and it can occupy the space on the cultural value front, and that is what they do, and that is where all parties have to battle with. And I think the lesson we can learn from countries like the United States and the degree of polarization in the United States is that socioeconomically, social inequality has got way out of hand, is out of control in the United States. But the real problem is really on the cultural side and on the value side, so that Democrats cannot talk to Republicans anymore, and that there is actually no room for compromises anymore, has to do with polarization on values. And that is really dangerous. And we should really focus on this aspect and make sure that we do not get into a situation where the political and societal debate is so polarized that we cannot talk to other people who might have different positions when it comes to cultural values. We have to be more open and tolerant on cultural values, and we also have to make it possible that people who have more conservative cultural values are still represented in the party system and do not have to vote for AfD because they have certain positions on cultural values. I think that is a debate we need to have.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point, because it's what very much defines German politics and the German debate in recent times, where it's always separate. It seems as if there's always already such a separation between those who say, well, this is can't be a problem, because if you say that it's a problem, we are telling the discourse of, or sharing what the AfD is telling. So I think
that is precisely my point. I think that is, the AfD is sort of, I'm really not in favor of discussing these issues with the AfD. I think the AfD is just, as a political party, is an extreme party we should not really engage with. But we need to engage with perspectives and viewpoints which say we have to look at globalization. We have to look at, we also have to have an open discussion about migration. It must be possible to have an open discussion about migration. We have to allow for different points of view. And we cannot just cancel people, or we cannot just oppress certain opinions because we don't like them. We say, this is the opinion of the AfD. I think we need to have this discussion.
Maybe it's also about telling a little different story, because it's, as you say, about globalization. It's not, maybe it's not about Islam or whatever. That's what is exploited as a threat and something which is very overdone. But on the other side, and I just wanted to don't know if you have followed the discussion I had with Jens Spahn on Monday evening. It's really interesting, because he's trying to explore and to go in that way and better understand also economic disruptions and so on. That's interesting. In his way, it's a very different way, but he's also talking about how at one point, it's interesting to see where you can find common points with people like Jens Spahn from conservative side, talking about globalization, where he's having in mind more this perspective that you mentioned of people who need or have are more attracted by this cultural side, and if you join both, you construct a better globalization in an economic sense. it may also help to avoid this. So maybe there are touching points. There are points where both the cultural and the economic side are going together. Just wanted to quote the excellent study of Timo Fetzer, who has wanted to join but who can't join for private reasons this morning, this session, who has done an excellent paper and published in the American Economic Review on the reasons for Brexit vote, which is extremely interesting, exploring the double impact of austerity and structural shifts and in this old industrial regions, which is very fruitful, very, very interesting, and leads to the question that Gustav Horn has also already raised. Apparently, austerity does also play a role. It's maybe both. It's the perspective of region plus some austerity, which is seen as some injustice, and that's something we may come back to. I wanted to just have, maybe it helps to better understand, to raise the question. Perhaps, Gustav, you can say something about what you think. Why is it? It's interesting that IFD and others have lost this year in a situation which was a crisis situation. And, you know, people tend to say, well, it's always in crisis situations that the government, well, it has not been the case in 2015. So it's not evident that in a crisis situation, governments profit from that. But do you have an idea of why they lose?
Well, let me first say some words on the issue of culture and economics, because I think it's a kind of complicated relationship, because you find correlation certainly for both on the voting behavior. I won't object that, but sometimes I interpret these results in the following way, that the cultural issues are sometimes the scapegoats for adverse economic effects. You can say that, for example, when you look at the anti-migration issue, the AfD got many successes in the voting behavior, telling people, these migrants come here to Germany and take away your jobs and your social security. And these people have never paid taxes in Germany. They have never worked in Germany, so they don't earn it. And this certainly links then migration, a cultural issue, strange people coming to Germany and taking away your money. That's a basic story they told, and they had successes on that with people who were afraid of their economic status, and that's totally plausible. So both certainly play a role. Also with the rise of the economic share of women. Some people are afraid of that. Some women are afraid of losing their jobs because women now want their job. That's the story the AfD tells sometimes. So we have an interconnection between those two issues. But in the end, it's certainly that the economic fears are certainly something which is very, very important. But you asked me, why is the AfD not so successful this year compared to 2015? Because we had that two crises, but the decision taken in this crisis were totally different. In 2015, the decision of the government was to let the migrants in. That was a decision that increased insecurity. In this crisis, there was an insecurity coming from outside by the virus, but the government's decision on economic issues were decisions that reduced insecurity by giving a lot of money to support firms, by giving short-time working money to the employees. And that were all measures to reduce insecurity. And that was a basic aim of the government in all these discussions. We have to give the money very fast to the people and to the firms so that insecurity will not rise during these very difficult times. And the government was successful with that. And by doing so, the AfD and other populists had no reason to complain. And that certainly made the difference in the perception of the situation. And that certainly is a lesson we have to follow in the future. As soon as the crisis is over, and as soon as those would prevail in the political debate that say now we have to be very, very frugal in our economic policy, then populism will rise again, I would say. And we have seen during the budget debate yesterday, and this will continue today, I suppose, that some people go already in that direction. And that is something I see with great concern.
I mean, I more or less share the diagnosis. Still, it's a little puzzling because, compared to the situation before before Corona, jobs were much more secure than they are now. I mean, there are a lot of people on short time and so on. So
yes, but this was a security which was not perceived as a result of government policies, but the economic situation was good. We were in a kind of boom. So people did not think much about the job insecurity. They thought about other things. And when the pandemic came, everybody saw that their jobs was at stake, closing down firms and a lot. And then the government stepped in and said, no, don't worry, we're doing something against that. And that certainly increased security. It's a feeling, it's a fear of losing a job, which is decisive, not that they'll really lose a job.
Robert, you raised your hand.
Yeah, if I may add just one or two thoughts on that. So the first is, and there's a nice recent study by Christoph Trebesch and others clearly showing this pandemic gives momentum to governments. Yeah, so there is a huge challenge and the government has to act and react. And this always leads to some rally around the flag effect, first and foremost. Yeah, so big social challenge, the government acts, this gives momentum to the government. And then it's very decisive how the government reacts. And populists really underperformed in this respect. So the handling of the pandemics is a disaster in the US and in the UK. Strange enough, this does not really lead to the populist base reacting in a way of decreasing support for the government, but surely it shows to everybody else that the whole populist approach is perhaps not the populist approach to politics is not the best when it comes to tackling real issues. And I think what went well in Germany is I'm very much with Gustav Horn that the government sent out this signal that it is willing to provide security. So you cannot blame the government for a natural disaster and you cannot blame the government for the pandemics. So I think this is something that people understand. This also goes into the direction of Roderick's argument that people understand that some developments cause insecurities. The question is, how do you address it? And the German government very successfully managed to provide this security. But I think the government, it was also an example of good policy communication. And this goes into the direction what Anke Hassel said. So how do you bring the message across? How do you organize support for your policies? And I think one important factor here was that there was a broad debate amongst the federal government and the state governments how to react to this crisis. This was a very public debate. This gave people the impression, okay, these people really care about what to do. They look for the best solution. There is some democratic process involved in finding a solution. They were very transparent in communicating their policy, and I think this contributed a lot to securing also the acceptance of a policy that is in the end very unpopular. And it was accompanied, and this is something which I find very interesting, by very successful communication by scientific experts. So I think it is a very, very good example how the virologists in a language that everybody could understand, explained what was happening. They were very transparent also in what they knew, what they just suspected, what they did not know. And in the very end, this really helped to have a fact-based discussion on how to deal with a broad challenge, which also counters the approach, I have very much the UK in mind, and it's a pity that Timo is not here. Where the whole discussion is in the end on the basis of bluster and misinformation, and in the US, people selling I've done everything I could to handle this pandemics and just talking nonsense. It was a very good example how to lead a discussion on the basis of facts. And I think we as economists can learn a lot from what the virologist did in here. And I hope that in general, there might be some lessons learned how to tackle this fake news approach that populist parties have. So apparently it's possible to bring in facts into a political discussion, have an open, transparent discussion, and act on the basis of that. And yeah, I think this was successful and may also have contributed to the fact that the AfD could not gain here in the crisis, because the policy it was good policy design, but it was also a very good debate on this policy.
Anke, you want to tell? Anke?
Yeah, first of all, I agree. Just one slight note on the UK, because I mean, on the pandemic, I agree. But if you look at the economic policies of the UK, and if you look at the introduction of the job retention scheme, this was a big success in the UK policymaking, because it has a liberal labour market in the UK. They never had a policy like that. They never even had the idea that you should keep people in jobs which are not viable anymore. And the whole, like in the US, the British labour market is really is based on flexibility and on movement, and that the UK government, within really a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, invented and introduced a job retention scheme, which is very similar, to some extent similar, to the German short-term working scheme. Is a huge success, and is something you would not really expect from a populist government. And and then you compare it to what the US has done on these kinds of issues, and that the US completely failed on introducing a similar scheme, even though they tried. So I think you have to give something to the UK government machinery, that they can also respond to a policy challenge, and they could do so in the job retention scheme, and they failed on the health side, which is an interesting puzzle, and one needs to look into that more closely. But what I wanted to say about the German response to the crisis is, I agree with that the approach the government took was a very measured approach, and it was very open towards experts, and it was evidence-based, and they tried to include as much evidence as possible. And I think that should become a role model for future policymaking, really to integrate people who know the substance of the policy field very carefully, and include them in the decision making. I think that is important. And what we see now, and that is the interesting part of it, is that the discussion is now shifting from the health aspect to the socioeconomic aspect, and focusing on schools and higher education and education policies. And if you listen to Angela Merkel in the last week, she said, we really want to prevent another lockdown, and we really want to focus on keeping schools open. And the whole school debate, has showed so many weaknesses of the German education system, and the investments that are now made available to invest in digital equipment of schools, also shows that this is also a great opportunity. I mean, if the pandemic would help us to really modernize the school system and the education system, this would be a huge asset. And if we can manage to do it in a similar way to the earlier responses, that we include experts, we really take seriously people who know about how a good school education system might work, what you have to focus on, what you have to keep in mind, etc. This would be a massive opportunity. And I also agree that might help us to keep the AfD at bay, because it delivers services to people who they eventually will appreciate as well. So good governance is always a good way of fighting the far right. I completely agree.
Okay. Gustav.
Yes, let me first, from a kind of insider position, confirm what Robert and Anke said. I've never seen in the several crises I had the opportunity to live through in the German economy, seen such an open discussion as in this crisis. Every Thursday, many economists gathered around the finance minister, and there was a very open-minded discussion. And this I haven't seen in previous crises. For example, 10 years ago, 12 years ago in the financial market crisis, we had very fierce debates among economists about how the government should react on the financial market crisis. And there was a lot of disagreement among economists. And this is not the case this time. The policies now applied would have been by many economists fundamentally rejected in 2008 and 2009. This has totally changed. The discussion were much more open-minded. The government was much more open-minded than it was at that time. And it applied a strategy which is also to some extent new. For example, on the federal level, in this crisis, we had much less investment into infrastructure and so on than in the financial market crisis. But what was done was that a lot of money is going to be shifted to the regional and local level. So that, for example, local authorities are now in a position to increase their investment significantly. Being now a chairman of a financial means committee on a local level, I know that our budget position as a local authority has improved actually during this crisis, because we get much more money now to do our investment than we had before. And that's a good strategy in this crisis, because many of the concerns raised by the populists were of local nature. There was a street which was totally disrupted in a way and not repaired because there was no money available. This can be changed right now. And it is connected with the idea of transforming our economy. At the school level now, we have just got a lot of money to buy tablets for all those pupils who have not the money to buy them. We can give to every pupil now some kind of digital equipment so that they can share a digital learning now. So, and this is something which was impossible throughout the last years. Now it is possible. So we transform. And also we have a lot of investment into ecological issues now. We are transforming our economy, we're transforming our society in this crisis to get out stronger than we got in. But let me raise one point which has not yet been discussed to a certain extent. The point is information. We live in a totally different environment than 10 years ago as far as information is concerned. Many people inform themselves, get the news out of social media. And we know that this is can be a very dangerous thing, because the algorithm lead you to news in a way which will confirm your views in a way and increase polarization in our society. We have seen that during this crisis to a large extent, when people cited sources to prove that the virus is not dangerous from some mediciners who have never published on that, who have never had thought on that, but made a video on YouTube, and this is cited as a reliable source. And this is provided to them by the algorithm because they have clicked on these kind of views all the time. And this certainly increases the rift, the cleavage in the society more and more. And this is something what has happened in the United States to a very large extent. I'm still shocked by the presidential debate last night, because these two candidates actually couldn't talk to each other. And that's something that reflects what's happening among people in the United States too. Many people can't talk to each other anymore. And that is based on a totally different perception of reality by these people. And this certainly is enhanced by the way social media and their algorithm functions. And we have to address this problem of information and fake news much more severely, because it certainly is a very big obstacle to reasonable politics.
Sorry, I was
Thomas has vanished.
Good point. I wanted to challenge still, coming back to Gustav. still challenge this view a little bit. I mean, the SPD has been, if it's about socioeconomic factors, if it's about insecurity, if it's about all these things, the least that we can say is that the SPD has done a lot of things in the last few years in this coalition, introducing minimum wage and having a lot of social instruments that reduce or should reduce sort of social insecurity. Still, the SPD is not really gaining, if to be modest, or to put it modestly. To the contrary, why is it? I mean, if maybe the diagnosis is wrong, why does the SPD don't profit from all this?
Well, in terms of traditional political criteria, the SPD has been very successful. You're absolutely right. If I look back what has been achieved, but what is being achieved still in this grand coalition. But in terms of providing the information that the SPD has been successful, the SPD is remarkably unsuccessful. And for example, I'm still very astonished that the big strategist fighting the coronavirus on the regional level in Germany is Markus Söder, which has the worst figures as far as infections are concerned. But he is present in the media. He is perceived as somebody who has ideas and who tells the ideas to the general public. And who of the Social Democratic prime minister, local regional prime minister, is perceived as such a strategist? Although there are much better figures in their regions, I can't see one. And that happens to many people now in leading positions in the Social Democratic. They don't come over in this new information environment, and that's something the SPD has to work on very severely during the next months in order to be successful in the next federal elections.
I would like to just know what you think. I would have maybe another potential explanation, just that people are, yes, they need sort of things like a minimum wage or something which protects them in a very difficult situation. But that's not what people aspire to. It's more they want to have a perspective and a good job and grow and so on. And it's good to have a protection net, but that's perhaps not enough. It's what people are missing is that perspective. And I'm in that sense always thinking about the sociologues analysis. Some of them, like comparing to the after-war period where everyone was going up and the escalator theme. And this is not the case anymore. So if that's the case, it's not enough to just have social policies or protection. Maybe because you have taken a lot of time, I'm playing the presidential. So I have given the word to Anke and Robert now.
Yeah, I think that is a debate the SPD must engage in, and I would be more on the side of Thomas and of Gustav to say, and it is a heated debate within the party. To what extent should the party really focus on social policies, on really focus on the left behinds, or whether they should focus on the aspiring middle classes? And this is the debate we already had when we talked about New Labour, when we talked about Gerhard Schröder, when we talked about the Neue Mitte. The Neue Mitte approach by Gerhard Schröder was exactly that we have to focus on those lower middle classes who are interested in upward social mobility, and we have to give them a scenario and a plan of how we can support them, if they want to have a career in their lives. And we know how the reforms of Gerhard Schröder backfired for the party. We can discuss how they backfired, what they meant for the country, but we definitely know, and we probably share, that they backfired for the party. And it introduced a cleavage and a fundamental conflict within the party between those who said, we are really a party which believes in social equality, and we focus on protecting the socially weak part of society, and those who said we need sound economic policies and we need to focus on people who are in the middle class or lower middle class and have upward aspirations. I think that is the discussion we had. And from my perspective, the party needs to do both. And in the last 5 to 10 years, haven't really solved this issue and have not really developed the policies which also give a reason to those voters to vote for them who don't think we need protection, who are not interested in another yet, debate on social assistance and Hartz IV, and is Hartz IV right or wrong, and do we need sanctions, yes or no? Who think this is really a crucial policy decision. I think the crucial policy decision is really to provide good public services to people, to provide good schools to people, to have good universities, to have a good health system, and to help people to navigate their lives more successfully. I think that would be an area where I would think the SPD has to do more and has to deliver more, and then combine it with the right people. And then I think they have more of an electoral chance in the next election. That would be my take on your question.
Okay. Robert, from...
I don't know much about the optimal strategy for the SPD, apart from the very fact that they have a problem in the very end in defining who their core electorate actually is, because the traditional blue collar worker in the end does not really exist anymore in Germany. And where to go? Yeah, that's a difficult question. Luckily, it's up to SPD leaders to decide where to go. I mean, the other aspect is, why don't they bring their successes across? Because as Gustav Horn said, and this was already a problem in the last grand coalition and discussed afterwards a lot, that the SPD managed, although they are the junior partner in the grand coalition, to do a lot of SPD politics, but somehow they don't get the message across. How successful they are in realizing parts of their agenda. And that's something, well, sure. I mean, the whole social media bubble is problematic there, but it's also due to the sender to deal with that. So it's I think others have been much more successful in developing strategies to address people via social media, to use new communication channels. It's certainly not easy. I agree that's super important to do that, because I mean, every economic model at the core, every microeconomic model at the core, has a well-informed economic subject making autonomous decision to increase his or her own benefit. But at the core of it is processing information in a meaningful and reliable way. And you see that populists are very successful in social media, and are very successful in spreading those fake news. And this in the end makes it, of course, impossible for people to make well-informed decisions if they rely on this information. I mean, that's very obvious in the UK, that the Brexiteers, the Leave voters, they are convinced that it is a good idea to leave the European Union with no deal, and it will grant them economic benefits. So based on obvious misinformation, they make a decision that I cannot imagine that they would have made the same decision if they had processed reliable news. So I think it's a big challenge to indeed counter this misinformation. It seems as if the SPD was not so super successful in their communication strategies here, if they don't even manage to bring their own message across. But how to do that? Well, yeah, that's challenging.
Maybe just because it's one of our leading topics in the last, or has been for the forum, this idea of a paradigm. I think that may help to explain, but just an idea. It may be more than just having a couple of the sum of some measures, and even communication. I mean, people have understood that there's been a minimum wage introduced and so on. So it's in a way the instruments in itself are communicated, are there, and so on. But maybe it's much more about a new storytelling, I mean, it's not only, it's not this alone, it's not the storytelling alone, but it's a whole idea of what is driving economic policy or social policies, what is our leading principle. And that's, I mean, the basic of our forum is to say there has been such a very strong paradigm in the past, and Gustav, you're describing it in your book also, which has been simple. And, you know, since Reagan and Thatcher and so on, they had their story, and that was simple, and it was very strong, guiding policies from the Washington Consensus to the European Union and so on. This is, I think, is there something like a new paradigm that is arising, or is that maybe the problem? I mean, it's more than just having some measures. It's that story, that paradigm, that guiding line for policies. Gustav, perhaps you wanted to.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's one thing: the SPD was way too slow. The SPD was too slow to accept a new paradigm. The SPD should have done that 10, 12 years ago, because at that financial market crisis, that was a point where it became obvious that the old paradigm was dysfunctional in a way. And that could have been a point of policy change in the Social Democratic Party. It hasn't been. They made a lot of measures which went into another direction, but after the crisis was over, they went back to the old strategy, defending, for example, the debt brake and all that stuff, austerity policy, die schwarze Null, and all that stuff was defended by the SPD. And thereby the SPD was identified with the old paradigm rather than a new paradigm. And that was wrong, in my view. And on the other hand, I think we are some steps further than Anke says. It is absolutely consensus now, at least the leading parts of the SPD, that we need a sound economic policy with an investment strategy on a local level to bring local authorities further, to raise the standard of living on a local and regional level. And all this is consensus in the party, but and the debates about the benefits of hard sphere or not, this debate is finished within the party, at least since last year, when there was a decision being made how to reform hard sphere, if the SPD could do it. And we move on, but we have not yet succeeded. We have not yet succeeded in creating the impression and creating the story of this change in the SPD to a general public. And that's something we have to work on. That's absolutely right. We have now a paradigm shift in the SPD, late, very late, but we have it now. And that is reflected in the decisions which have been taken during the crisis. There was no debate whether it should be a stimulus package or not. It was accepted right from the beginning. There has to be a stimulus package. We just discussed how it should be constructed and which measures should be included and which not. But the fundamental debate was over. It was quite clear. Neoliberalism was not a measure that should be taken right now. And the SPD was certainly the party in the government which was driving this change. And Angela Merkel, she's a very pragmatic person. She saw the SPD has some recipe against this crisis, so let's do it. And in the end, it was her benefit. So, but that will change next year, as Anke already told. Angela Merkel will no longer be chancellor next year. And let's see what happens then to the Christian Democrats, and if the Christian Democrats will credibly go on with this pragmatic course Angela Merkel has. And that will be the decisive point, whether the Christian Democrats will really be the strongest party after the election.
Okay. I would like to bring in Tore from our team, who would like to...
Yes, hi, Gustav. My question would go to you, as I'm also a member of the SPD. I think it is very important how we define the audience of the SPD and how we to whom we have to talk. And in recent years, we saw developments, especially in the trade unions, who were supposed to be the target audience of the SPD, in how far, but they we saw some evidence that the AfD got very strong, especially in the IG Metall, and I see some kind of discrepancy between the social science and economic science departments of the IMK, for example, and the research departments, and the actual people who are in the trade unions. And my question would be, how can we address these people who are kind of fearing the change of the new paradigm, but as a party or a trade union, you accepted the paradigm shift? But how do we communicate this to the core audience of the party?
That is certainly one very important task. We have seen that during this crisis already. This rift. It was the debate about some subsidies on the combustion vehicles, and the government refused to do so, and rightly refused to do so, and the trade unions were very much annoyed about that. And I think that exactly describes now where we have to discuss. The Social Democrats want the society to change, want the economy to change, because we have to meet the challenges of digitalization and a more sustainable way of production, but without losing many jobs. So what we have to do is we have to tell people, yes, you have to change. And you have to change by doing more investment in changing production structures, for example. And this is something which we will support. We will not support the present structures. We will not support the status quo, but we will support the change. The change within, you can preserve your jobs for some time. We give you money to do this investment. We give you any support to keep the jobs. We give you any support to qualify people for the new kind of jobs, but we don't give you money to produce the same goods you have produced during the recent decades. And that's the message we have given to the trade unions. And after an initial phase of being very annoyed, especially in the IG Metall, they're now slowly accept this course and use the chances which are coming with this course, and use the investment means they're getting with this course. And I think this is a kind of difficult times between the Social Democrats and the trade unions, but it's a time of discussion, of limited conflict, and we have to find a new common basis to go into the future. But I don't see that we should simply be the party which just preserving existing structures at the expense of meeting the challenging of digitalization and sustainable production. That can't be a successful way. Can't maybe successful temporarily, but certainly not in the longer future.
Okay, thank you. Just to say that we're not only talking about the SPD. The interesting thing is that you see any parallels, some parallels in other parties. I mentioned to talk with Jens Spahn, who's picking up some of these ideas of how to redesign globalization, how to be more social, and so on. There is in the FDP even are people who are thinking about trying of a more inclusive liberalism. I think that's a challenge which goes beyond party structures and parties to cope with these new challenges. And the interesting thing is also to talk about the next party or the other party, important party now, the Greens, which is, well, it has been interesting to see how they lost in the pandemic. I mean, how fast they lost in the pandemic. Maybe it's also a sign of they have a very, very good point in climate. And it's now the big challenge, and everyone sees, and that's maybe why they are having a good point there, and why they are very strong and still strong. But maybe the pandemic also showed that that's maybe not enough in long term. There's something different that people want. I would like to ask Mark. You had a very interesting question on Mark Adam on Zoom already. Maybe you can put it short and introduce your thing.
Yeah, I will try. Sorry, but yeah, thanks. My question, what we didn't talk about was sort of the bank sector, the financial system, and there has been a lot of research about private fueled debt booms, and then there's a financial crisis and there's debt overhang, and there has been some research done that financial crisis can be linked to populism. And basically, I'm wondering if maybe there is a debt crisis right now looming, and if we might face populism from that angle. And maybe not this time, but I would say that the regulation of the financial system is far from over, and that if not in this crisis, we might face populism from that angle as well. Maybe one reason why we fared well through that crisis is because of the KfW, and you had loans to small enterprises to weather the crisis at the moment. But maybe also not everything is going well with those loans. And I'm wondering if fiscal policy, I mean, of course, you don't want to have austerity, and you need to respond to a crisis. But in the very short run, in a financial crisis, it's very hard to gegensteuern. As Gustav von said, I would say, I would imagine, I don't know. I'm wondering what your opinion is.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask Anke one thing, and we can come back to that point immediately. But as we are talking about the social and economic effects, and as political scientists, one striking fact is among populism in Germany, especially the AfD, is that they don't really exploit this point. I mean, they are not, I mean, they're talking about nation, about immigrants and so on, but they're not exploring this or exploiting this social economic things. So they are, and that's the difference to, for example, the right wing in France or in Italy, where they are very offensively, very directly also addressing these social issues. And I mean, that's, we know as Germans, that's the historically the very dangerous mix. I mean, that's what the Nazis have done, you know, bring both parts together. What is your take on that? I mean, the AfD fundamentally is in economic terms more a neoliberal, market liberal party. I mean, isn't that the danger at some point? And people have talked about that. So at some points in the East, they are trying to explore to go this way. Would that be the big danger if they see themselves as the party that are not only defending national culture, but also people and socially and economic terms?
So the AfD, I think for the AfD, the point when they realized that it wouldn't be easy for them is when they started to work on a pension reform. And, you know, in the last year, the AfD tried to propose a pension reform, and they ended up with sort of pensions for Germans as the key sort of slogan, that they want to have better pensions for Germans than compared to non-Germans. I think the reason why the AfD is not going for social issues is because we already have three parties on the left who focus a lot on social issues, and electorally they would not make major inroads if they started to compete on social issues with parties like Die Linke or the SPD and even the Green Party, because they're very strong on social policy. I think for them it is a deliberate choice that they basically have given up on this and realized that they cannot really compete on that. And plus the whole history of the AfD is different from the history of many other populist parties in Europe, because they come from economists. I mean, economists set up the AfD, and von Lucke, you know, was the first chairman, and the whole sort of Euro history of the AfD also gives them a much more neoclassical, neoliberal leaning, which does not lend itself easily to going to the other side and say, you know, we make a major point on campaigning on social issues. I think that would be my two parts of the explanation why the AfD is very reluctant in engaging and having a much stronger social profile. But I would like to come back to what you said earlier about the paradigms, because that is what you're working on the new paradigms. And I find it actually very interesting to see where is the new economic paradigm, and how are different governments or different countries embracing this discussion. Because when we look at the populist government in the US, we see that the paradigm, the economic paradigm of Trump is America first. And that is a very clear statement, and it has very clear economic implications to do with protectionism, but also to do with industrial policies, and it is a very clear signal. And to some extent, if you look at Johnson in the UK, he is also not a Thatcherite in economic policies. He is not, and he's thinking of how to develop the north of England, how to have policies that have more regional components, etc. So I think he is not someone who is really a neoliberal in economic terms. So they are setting, the populists setting an economic agenda, and the economic agenda of the non-populists, or the only one I can see at the moment, is the Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal is nothing you can really campaign on, or it is very hard to campaign on the Green New Deal because it is so focused on a very specific perspective on the climate crisis and the green transition. So I think there is an opportunity, but also a need for centrist parties to really think hard about the new economic paradigm. And we know, the role of the state has become much more important through the pandemic. The government is now much more involved in many areas of economic activity. It's propping up businesses. We are investing heavily in companies, but also bailing out companies, but also in short-time working. But this needs a sort of more coherent concept, and it needs a more coherent message. What is actually the government, a centrist government? What are they trying to do, and what is the economic message? So I think we still have work to do on developing a new economic paradigm, which is sort of simple enough for people to understand what it means, and what the implications are in sort of compared to the America first or UK first or France first, and how can we develop it, and what are the cornerstones of this concept? I think there is still a lot to discuss.
Yes, absolutely. That's why we think we have still a lot to do. And I want to attract, because Gustav talked about the role of the financial crisis, want to attract on attention again on the very smart and short and first rough presentation that we will do in a couple of minutes on the role of buzzwords. That's really striking. At least ex post, so for the past, and it shows how much these words are, how important they are, and they are reflecting what you say, a coherent new storytelling. And it was, I I listened to that part of the debate last night. It was really striking, and it was a very bad moment when Trump tried to say, well, you are the guy who is defending the Green New Deal. And instead of saying, yes, I'm doing, in the American context, as he has pushed him, so, it's seen as something leftist, and he's very much working on that. And Joe Biden tries to not be leftist. And so on. And at one point, Joe Biden said, no, I'm not for the Green New Deal. Very explicitly. So it was like, yeah, okay, what are you for? What is the story that you're telling in economic terms? The Democrats are trying just to avoid Trump and not to tell the new story. But that has shown how much, even in the US, the Democrats don't have such a new concept, and at least not a consensus about such a new concept. We have 5 minutes left. I would just like to come back to the question, the very concrete question on the next couple of months and next year. In December 2021, so in 1 year, maybe more or less the day, I don't know if the date is fixed already, there will be the federal elections. So we had a consensus about saying, well, it's not over, there are more fundamental reasons, but what about the next month? Is there a chance that, a chance for us, for people who don't want the AfD to gain, that they will keep at that level, stay at that level, so lose very much compared to last time? Or is there a risk, like Gustav, you said, that if the discussion starts about austerity, that the opposite will happen? Maybe that's too short as an impact, but I would like to have a short take on that. Perhaps Gustav, you can with a forecast of how much the AfD will have in September 2021, just as a small game?
Well, it's very difficult to forecast election results these days, but I would say that there's a good chance that they will have that they will stay in the one, but will be reduced to the one-digit figures, because the time is too short. I think that all this neoliberal paradigm will be restored within due time to the election. There is a danger, for example, if the Christian Democrats elect Friedrich Merz as their leader and as a candidate for chancellery, then there may be indeed such a kind of policy strategy, and then I would have to revise my forecast, I would say. Then there will be into double-digit figures. But if things move another way, I would say they will stay in the one-digit figures, because all the other parties will provide some sort of impression that people will be secure despite the crisis, and they will continue with that kind of policy. And so I'm slightly optimistic that we might reduce them to some extent, but it's like with the virus, they're still there, and there may be other times when we are less resilient. And in the question we have been by Mark, it came up, for example, this time it was not the financial sector, but still we are far away from a secure financial sector. The regulation is way away from a point where I would say this is a stable financial sector. And if you look at the difficulties of introducing, for example, a financial transaction tax, we see that resistance is still very, very strong. And there may be another time when the next crisis comes again from the financial sector. And then we have to say, there we are again. And so nothing is totally safe at the moment, but we have a good chance.
Okay, maybe passing to Anke, I may add or make it more exciting, saying, I mean, very much will depend evidently on the coming winter and Corona. Maybe just as a more negative idea, if Corona gets out of control, that's maybe not happening, but if the government loses this image of having things under control, maybe then the situation will be very different. If the diagnosis is right that you did at the beginning, that this feeling of the government is doing the right thing has helped, so and avoided the AfD to gain. Anke, what is your forecast?
I think we really don't know. I would really say, the future is so open at the moment, and so many things can happen in various directions. And if your scenario would take place, that Corona is out of control, we sort of get a French scenario or an Italian scenario of the spring. Would that lead to more support of the AfD? I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think, if we look back on what happened in March and April, and the discussion was very much on the health system, on the intensive care, on death rates, etc. I think the focus will be a lot on the executive, and a time of crisis is always a time of the executive. I don't think that would help the AfD. I think the danger in terms of populism is really more in the medium term, after the election, after when short-time working runs out as policy, when people lose their jobs, when there is a massive restructuring in manufacturing industries, but also in other companies that cannot continue, where the business model doesn't work anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So when economic insecurity really hit, it's not the pandemic as such that will drive the AfD or potential votes for the AfD, but it's really an increase in economic insecurity, which is most likely to take place next year after the election and not before.
Thank you. Robert.
Well, I also think that the AfD will stay below 10%. I don't think that the AfD has good strategic options at the very moment. They try a little bit to establish themselves as an anti-EU party, but this does not ring well with the German voters, I think, because the EU has strong support in Germany. They try out aligning with those anti-pandemic measures, this anti-vaccinists and so, but this might even cost them a part of the core voters, which are not, some of them are very much in favor with the measures in place. So in the very end, I think they all they have left is the anti-immigration platform. They will mobilize voters that are attracted by that, and that's it. But as Mark said, the next crisis is there to come. Interestingly, I looked a little bit into the data in regional exposure to the financial crisis, where you regions where many insolvencies increased a lot in 2009 in reaction to the crisis, and we had a lot of applications to the furlong scheme. And these regions, it's not necessarily the AfD that benefited, but it's the far right nationalist parties, NPD and parties like that. This is, if you, I'm not so much interested in the AfD per se, but in this underlying voting potential, which is bigger. And there, I think, of course, this is the next crisis. If it is not countered by the right policy measures, will increase the voting potential for parties and candidates that have a very nationalistic stance. I think, last sentence, indeed, that a good paradigm might help. I think it would be helpful if the executive, if the established parties could more transparently communicate what this is all there for. So why do we negotiate free trade agreements? Why do we invest into furthering economic integration? So under Erhard, it was welfare for all. That's a good statement. That's something what people can understand. Now it's very much about technical details. Why do we support the banking sector? Why do we have quantitative easing? So there's no good answer to that. I think it would be very helpful to have a statement like that. I don't know what it in the moment would be, security for all and welfare for some, or so. It does not ring that well. So I think, of course, one has also to carefully think about policy. But I think one should explain economic policies better in a way what they contribute indeed to aggregate welfare. But it's not only about communication and strategic campaigning. I think, of course, it also has to be accompanied by effective and credible policies to deliver on these promises. And yeah, I think we have made some progress in this respect over the last couple of months.
If it's been to be a little polemic in the German context, if it's just about marketing and charisma and so on, the FDP would be much stronger with a very smart man like Christian Lindner. But apparently, it's not only about that. It needs to fund the core. And then we need to say, I mean, the FDP is particularly lost in the past, in a period where market liberalism has lost, and it's a very deep crisis of credibility. But it touches all the other parties, and we talked about Merkel. The CDU is maybe essentially keeping their level because of Merkel, and behind it doesn't seem as if there's a real clear vision of what's coming up. So I think we're in the midst of a very interesting debate, and just to mention this again, Robert, you're in the midst of this academic research. It's a quite recent field, and if you start from that, it's we need to say, and I think it's you're modest, I know you, and to say, well, we're in the midst of exploring that and of better understanding what is happening and why are people voting for extremist parties. And we have done, if I may say, you have done, and a lot of colleagues have done a lot of progress in the last couple of years, but I think it's still not 100% clear what it is and what to do. And it's been clear in the discussion also, and it's a way and on a search that we are on, and that's interesting. I mean, it's very important because there's much at stake if we don't stop populism. But it's interesting to follow and intellectually anyway, and to listen to all your thoughts. That is very inspiring. So thanks a lot for joining this panel and this discussion. We had already sessions on populism where Robert and others have presented papers, and we will have another panels for sure, because that's one of our guiding interests to combine this vacuum of paradigmatic vacuum, the link between this paradigmatic view and populism, which is very much at the core of our problems today. So thanks a lot, and yeah, hopefully we see all soon back. We were very happy to see a lot of people in real yesterday. Today we are in a virtual mode, and that has been functioning again and very well. So thank you, and stay tuned.
Thank you.
Thanks. It was a great pleasure. See you.
I will say, let's have 2 minutes of a break to all the people online. We'll be back in 2 minutes to prepare the presentation, and then have our speed dating on the ups and downs of buzzwords, market liberal buzzwords, before we then go on later in the morning to talk about Germany's role in the Eurozone. So, in this. So hello and hello back again. As promised, we will now switch to a short session that we used to call speed dating. That's something we invented some workshops ago to have an opportunity in between larger sessions to introduce short, quick ideas, to let people introduce something that is shortly presented and then shortly discussed. And this time, the speed dating is, let's say, our own topic. We've been working from the start, and I need to share my screen in a second. We've been working it's perfectly in line with what we said, just discussed a minute ago, on the paradigmatic issues, which is the basic idea that we followed from the beginning, is that one of the main reasons of populism, and that's the time when we started, end of 2016, after the election of Trump, we started to explore this project. The basic idea was to say, if there's populism, it has to do very probably with the fall of a paradigm which has been dominant for a couple of decades. It's what we call neoliberal, market liberal, market fundamentalism, like some in the US and UK call it. It has started in the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher. In Germany, there has been, in a different way, also a turn towards these more market liberal supply side policies and so on. And that has dominated, in a way, economic thinking, economic policy making for a couple of decades, 3 to 4 decades. And it's interesting to see, it doesn't mean that this paradigm is applied every day, and it doesn't mean at all that what the fundamentalists, market fundamentalists, think has been applied one by one, but it has been the guiding principle for a long time. It has been something which has driven economic policy making, narratives, what media are saying, and what is. And that's very important to understand. And we've done a lot of studies on how important these paradigms are guiding policy making at different levels. I talked about media. It's about the administrations, where people follow what the paradigm is. They don't really reflect at each decision on the fundamentals of, is it right or wrong. There are some guiding lines that follow. And we have seen that in Germany. We've seen that internationally. It's talking about the Washington Consensus, about the time. Yesterday we had some discussions about the origin. We have another discussion on the euro. And that at the time when people thought about how to design the euro, it was the high time of market liberalism. And so it very much define how they did this. In the end, they didn't forecast any or prepare the Eurozone to something like a big financial crisis, because financial markets were considered to be efficient. So that seems to be a very important thing, these paradigms. And paradigms are always driven, and we have mentioned that 10 minutes ago in the former discussion. It's not only about narratives, it's about fundamental issues, it's about fundamental things, it's real, it's not just about talking, but narratives are very important. I remember a very inspiring presentation that Anatoly Kaletsky, who was there yesterday too, has done 1 or 2 years ago at one of our workshops, exploring how the market liberals transformed a lot of their thinking into very simple words. And that was not easy, because the neoclassical or monetarist theory and the thinking is not, by evidence, is not simple. It had to be translated into some very simple words, like cut taxes, like reduce the influence of state, and so on. There were some buzzwords in this very clearly. What Anatol did at the time was exploring the logic between the complicated economic theory and wordings. What we started to do, and we want to put a focus on this for the next couple of months, the importance of narratives and paradigms in this global understanding. So we started to do some work, and that's something we want to share. It's very early, it's very rough work, it's something very simple in the end, where we try to understand the role of narratives in Germany. And just to start, we just started to check what are the big words which have driven economic thinking and market liberal thinking in Germany in the last couple of decades, and especially at the time of the Agenda 2010 is for sure, but also in the time before, and then check how these words have developed. So that's what we would like to present in the next couple of minutes. Anne, you're online, may say just some words on the technical things, what we did. We were very much inspired by the work of Robert Schiller, who has written and published a book on narratives last year, and was used as one tool, as a very simple tool, Google Books Ngram viewer. And on narratives, just to quote him, he has said, as with any kind of historical reconstruction, we cannot go back in time with a sound recorder to capture the conversations that created and spread narratives. However, we can now capture the contemporary narrative through tools such as Ngram. So that's what we did, and Anna may say some words on the technical side. Please, Anna.
Yes, I would like to start by pointing out that we are still missing the theory behind all of this. So far, our analysis is basically based on the intuition that the frequency with which certain words or concepts are used in society is in some way related to the prevailing paradigm. We used, as Thomas mentioned, the Google Books Ngram view. It was developed by Jean-Baptiste Michel and a number of other scientists to look at how certain words that, in our opinion, represent the formerly dominant free market paradigm in Germany are used in German books over time. And we looked at the period from 1945 to 2019. But of course, the later period will be more interesting. The Ngram's view is based on the corpus of books that were scanned by Google Books, and this corpus is estimated to contain 4% of all books ever published. But unfortunately, we can't say what percentage of all German books it includes. So, but because we are only looking at the German part of this corpus. And what we'll see in the graphs in a moment is the number of appearances of a specific word, or sometimes a sequence of words in a given year in the German corpus, and divided by the total number of words or sequences in the German corpus in this year. This is to account for the increase in the number of books over time.
Thank you. I have two. How can I? Okay, simply. So we started to explore, and that's what we just wanted to share because we were very struck by the results and still early work, as we say. So we're very happy to get any input, any reflection on that, maybe caveats that we're missing. So we took the typical words which represented the market liberal thinking. It's in German Eigenverantwortung, Eigenvorsorge, so self-responsibility or personal provision, or high performer Leistungsträger, which was something which is very core, has been very core in the debates at these times. And what we discovered is striking, is we put the line on in 2007, which is the year before the financial crisis, or when the financial crisis started and the financial crisis got broke out and was apparent to the broader public in 2008. it is striking. We have this year this height of these words, the top levels of the words Eigenverantwortung, Eigenvorsorge, Leistungsträger in 2007, 2008. It's the profile in detail is maybe sometimes somewhat different, but it seems as if there's something that happened in 2007 or 2008. In other words, and just going through them, Fehlanreize, which has been an argument in economic thinking that a lot of social measures in the German system are giving Fehlanreize, disincentives. So it's a very market liberal thinking. Even the word competitiveness, Wettbewerbsfähigkeit in that neutral term has been very dominant in economic debates in the years 1990 to 2000. Even before, as we see, it's starting in the 80s, and as for disincentives, also something which has started to develop to grow, and then have had a very striking high in the 1990s and 2000s. Both again break in 2007. Just getting forward, we took another word, globalization shock, also interesting. I mean, it's something which appeared in the mid 1990s. That has been the time when in Germany there was Standortdebatte on competitiveness, and it has had its high time. It's breaking a little before 2007, but goes on and very much down since. Standortwettbewerb and how can I get back? So Standortwettbewerb, tax competition, also some buzzwords of this neoliberal times, also breaking in 2007 or around this date, and then going down very steep decline afterwards. Deregulation, privatization, some differences in detail. Privatization has been a big word in Germany in the 1990s, but that's very much linked to the unification or the fall of the war. There has been until 1995, I mean, until the end of the Treuhandanstalt, for evidence, been a huge discussion about privatization in Germany, which was very much due to that situation, but also reflecting a broader trend. So we see that this word still has a certain importance during the whole time, and then again breaks after the financial crisis. Privatization is not as clear, but it's at another level. You see that there's a rise of the word privatization since the early 1980s, and then it starts to go down a little earlier. But it seems again that after 2007, at least, there's no up anymore. Labor market flexibility, also a buzzword, Flexibilität des Arbeitsmarktes, where we see that the blue line breaks in 2007, 2008. Tarifkartell was one other word that we found that has been a very important word, which reflects, I mean, we need words which are only used in one sense. You know, we wanted to avoid words that could be used in both senses, so that maybe a high of a word is just reflecting a negative use of that word. Tarifkartell is something which is always used by market liberals to describe that's bad. I mean, cartel is bad, and so that's a very clear sense of it. You see that there is it's going up in the 80s a little bit, then it goes up very strongly in the 1990s, 2000s. It stopped before 2007. Not really sure why. Maybe it has been at the core again of the Agenda 2010 debates. So it goes on before, but again, it's not coming back after 2007. We just put, in the end, we thought, well, let's put very simple words like markets, like market, like competition, which also seem to give us the same profile after 2007. And government intervention, again, a word that, you know, people who like government intervention wouldn't call it government intervention. It's staatliche Eingriffe is always used by people who are more market liberal, because it's more in a negative way, used in a negative way. And again, see a break after 2007. We're nearly through. It's interesting, even shares, Aktien. We see a profile like this, where there's an upswing during the 1990s, all very often starting in the 80s and 90s and 2000, and again a break in 2007, after 2007, and another word, kapitalgedeckte Altersvorsorge, which, I mean, were very low levels of, as you see, the percentage rates are very low, but anyway, the profile again seems striking. Finanzmarkteffizienz is very volatile, like financial markets are, maybe, but also there we see that there's a high time before the crisis, and maybe also due to the fact that in the crisis, the term has been used in both ways, so that may be something we need to be careful to not overinterpret. This is all, as we said, it's very preliminary. We just used a very simple method inspired by Bob Schiller, who's done the same exercise for other purposes using n-grams. So it's we are very excited and very hopefully getting more input on that. But we need to say a lot of things about it. It's just the books. We probably would need to explore very much more on other tools, social media, whatever, to confirm this. Maybe that's, but it seems so striking and so clear that there's been something happening in 2007-8 with all these words, at least with the methodology that we use, that it seems as if there's a link. And that's striking. I think we had the discussion this morning on populism and the role of the financial crisis, and we all had in mind that it seems as if the financial crisis has had an impact on and broken or contributed to some ending of this old paradigm. But I wouldn't have expected this. I mean, maybe we're wrong in some way, but seeing that this has had an impact on this narratives, which reflect much more, has not been apparent at that time. And we just had one thinking, yes, it could have been that during the financial crisis and the high time, maybe even the Euro crisis, it may be, as we use and we measure relative terms, it may be that just in that time, there have been other words coming up, you know, and then the relative terms go down. But the striking thing is that it doesn't come back. So the number for the percentage rates of the use of these words goes down and doesn't come back. It's over. So maybe that's just a puzzle, a piece of a puzzle of understanding what paradigms is and where we are, but it may be a very important piece. So that reflects that we are already very advanced in, you know, the search of a new paradigm, or at least the end of the old paradigm. So that's been our work on this. We're very excited, very happy to hear your thoughts on that, if there's any immediately. And would very much like to collect any suggestion for the further work. As I said, it's just first step, but a very striking one. So is there any comments? Don't see any. Okay. Let's see that someone written. As we don't have so much time left, we will just collect any further thoughts that you can share. Thanks, Anne, for this work. You have very much driven this technical exploration. So thanks for that. And we can go, I mean, we have a little break again, or that's a little break until 11:30 to start the next session. So if there's any comment on the presentation we had, please send us whatever way we have prepared, and we can reconvene in 15 minutes. So thanks.
Ja, der Ton sollte funktionieren. Ich glaube, das liegt nur daran, dass niemand redet, oder?
Alles klar, okay.
Ja.
Scheint zu funktionieren.
Wir warten jetzt eigentlich nur noch auf Martin, aber wir können jetzt gleich loslegen, dann...
Ich bin auch da. Kann mich jeder verstehen? Can everybody hear me?
Ja.
Okay. Sorry, Mark, jetzt hier.
Okay, we're still missing Martin, I think, but it's 11:30, so we would like to start and with this our final and very exciting panel on the future role of Germany in the Eurozone or in Europe. I mean, we wanted to concentrate a little bit more on the Eurozone, but a lot of questions will concern Europe as a whole. Just saying that we already touched, and some of you have been following the discussions a lot of times, this question, and we're very happy to have a final session to concentrate all these questions on fiscal policy and whatever institutional aspects in that broader sense, because the big topic of our workshop has been the future of the German economic model. And we don't have to explain a long time or a lot how much this future model will depend on the role and a good role of Germany in the Eurozone or in Europe, because otherwise Germany will not function and the economy will have to struggle to function. I will immediately hand over to Mark Schieritz, who has accepted to moderate this session. Mark Schieritz is as we all know, well-known, excellent journalist at Die Zeit. And please, Mark, your turn.
Thank you, Thomas, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be part of this event. As you said, you touched on some of the issues concerning Germany. I think the idea now is just to put some of these strings together to get a broader picture also in the European context. The way I'd like to go about is to have short statements by everyone, 5 to 7 minutes, I guess is the idea. I'll try to interrupt you if you go on for too long. And I'd like to go by the order of the alphabet. So Clemens Fuß would be the first one with 5 to 7 minutes. Please, Clemens Fuß.
Okay, thank you very much. Excited to be here and thanks for the invitation to this discussion. I suppose I would like to make 3 points. If we think about Germany in the next years and compare it to how it fared after the last crisis, I think that this time will be different. This time will be much more difficult. If we remember what happened after the financial crisis, this was a deep crisis. The labor market was in difficulties. Government debt went up in Germany as everywhere else. But after the crisis, Germany recovered without great effort. This was because there was an employment boom driven by a strong recovery of the economy, especially outside Europe. And Germany benefited from that through its export model. Interest rates declined and the unemployment declined, and the combination of that allowed the government to increase its spending massively, have a large and long-term pro-cyclical fiscal expansion over these years without increasing government debt. Now, in fact, government debt, as we all know, the debt ratio declined. Germany benefited from the fact that its baby boomer generation was at the height of its productivity and of its earnings. And that made things easy for Germany during in this period. Now, as we all know, things were a bit less easy for other countries in Europe, but for Germany, this economic boom, this very positive economic development, came without great effort. Now, this time it's going to be very different because there is not going to be the benefit of declining interest costs. Interest costs are extremely low, so in the short term, servicing government debt is not a problem. But there will not be this additional space created in the budget. There will not be additional space created by increasing employment, and there will not be increasing economic growth due to growing employment. Because in terms of there's not the potential to reduce unemployment very much, and the demographics will change direction. So the baby boomer generation in the coming years will go into retirement. That will be a drag on economic growth. And it will be a drag on government finances, a very massive one. So companies are aware of that, and that's why they're, in their investment decisions, they will consider Germany as being less attractive than other locations simply because there are fewer people. And that is a problem. And on top of that, we have the entire transformation of the economy, the green transformation, the digital transformation, and this is not to the benefit of some of the key industries, as we all know in Germany. So the car industry, Germany's most important industry, is in the middle of a very complex transformation. A lot of companies are currently reconsidering where they produce, and Germany is one of the losers because it's a high-cost location and its comparative advantage is very much in combustion engine production. So as we can see, as we speak, the news is coming in that companies are shedding employment. It's not all bad, because there are companies in Germany that will continue to have a strong position in world markets. But again, the German economy is facing headwinds. Now, what about the Eurozone? The Eurozone will face increasing divergence in the coming year. That's pretty obvious. We see that the southern countries that were hit by the financial crisis and recovered more slowly are again hit more strongly. At least that's what the data currently says. That debt ratios will increase. We will have Italy at a debt to GDP ratio of between 150, depending on the scenario, and 160%. France at 120, and so on. So the divergence in that regard in the Eurozone will increase, and so will the tensions. My expectations is the Eurozone will more or less kick the can down the road, which works as long as interest rates remain low and investor confidence remains. And I don't think it's going to go away very quickly, because there is, if you look at other countries in other areas, there are problems as well. But the Eurozone will resemble increasingly a house of cards, not in terms of there being many political intrigues, but in terms of this being an increasingly fragile construction with, as we know, in principle, an institutional framework with a no bailout rule, where countries have to respond for their own debt, and at the same time, countries being unable to maintain the confidence of investors without support by the ESM and the ECB. So this will continue for, this can be maintained for some time. My concern is that it will be very hard to get back to an economic situation which is so robust that we can confront the next crisis, because the next crisis will come within the next 10 years. And if we don't get down our debt to GDP ratio, and if we don't get growth going, it will be very hard to confront this. There is, in fact, little Germany as such can do about that. What will happen depends on economic policies in Paris, in Madrid, and in Rome. And Germany will have, will struggle to maintain its own growth and to in the medium term, and that's what it will focus on. Thank you.
Thank you for what was actually a pretty gloomy picture of the future. Of course, this was Clemens Fuest, head of the IFO Institute in Munich and former professor at Oxford University, among other universities. I'd like now to go to Maria de Merzis, Deputy Director at Bruegel. She has previously worked at the European Commission and the European and the Dutch Central Bank. Sorry, Maria, what is your take?
Thank you very much. I followed your event actually the previous days. So congratulations, it's been extremely interesting to listen to that. It's very difficult not to share some of the pessimism that Clemens just put forward. I think there is truth in there. And there is no doubt that the problems ahead are not going to be small problems, and let me then perhaps add two more points just to give a different flavor to the discussion. We were asked to comment on the macroeconomic policy mix for the Eurozone. So on the fiscal side, we have a new tool that it has been actually, if you ask me, maybe not a Hamiltonian moment, but it is remarkable in many senses. The issuance of common debt is remarkable in Europe, and whether it is here to stay or not, it depends. But in any case, I believe this is an incredible achievement. And I actually believe that Germany had a lot to do with that. I mean, I think it was Germany who made that possible. Because it is Germany that visibly changed tack when it came to this issue. And the question is why? Why did Germany change tack on this, and to what end? Perhaps I'll come back to this when I talk a little bit about the external challenges. But I think the defining characteristic of whether this new generation EU will be a success or not will be the way that we govern it. The governance issue is going to define whether this is a good tool here to stay or a bad tool that we experimented with and then it goes away and we come back to the previous status quo. That's on the fiscal side. On the monetary policy side, I think there is a lot on the plate for the ECB, but I think the biggest challenge for the ECB is that it has to navigate in the dark. There's just so much that is going on in the global economy that affects the European economy, on the digital transformation, everything that affects the real economy that the ECB needs to manage in its macroeconomic management and the demand management. That is actually going to be, very difficult to account for this uncertainty. So what I think is important there is not to add on what we call policy uncertainty. It's important not to add policy uncertainty to what the ECB has to do. And here, if you allow me, I think the Constitutional Court decision actually added to this uncertainty. And I think it's important to reflect why this happened. A lot of the narrative was out there in terms of challenging the independence of the ECB. I'm a bit confused about that because typically we think about independence in the context of independence from the executive. Nobody's independent from the judiciary. I think we're all accountable to the judiciary, and the ECB is also accountable to the judiciary. But the question is which judiciary, and this is where the uncertainty came in. To the extent that such uncertainty on the judiciary side is possible in the context of the Eurozone, I think we need to do whatever we can to remove it, because that does not add to the difficulties that the ECB is going to have to follow in the future, irrespective of what your view is in the direction of travel when it comes to monetary policy. So I think it's important to remove that and any other policy uncertainty. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about a little bit in terms of thoughts that I would like to bring to discussion is the external challenges. I mean, there is no doubt that the ability to meet external challenges will be conditioned by how well we meet our internal challenges. But there are certain things that I believe the Eurozone, maybe Europe more generally, is lacking behind, and that is the vision of where we are on the global scene, on this global order, on multilateralism. And I don't mean on foreign policy. I mean, foreign policy is, of course, an important aspect of it, but I mean more about the economic foreign policy, if you like. The role of the euro. I don't believe that the euro can really challenge the dollar if we don't have a big scale safe asset. I think that's, maybe the New Generation Fund is a first step to that, but it's certainly not the last step. And until we have a big safe asset, we will not have a bigger role for the euro, in my view. But the multilateral system, and what we mean by that, the global governance, and who is writing the new global book, is something that I think Europe needs to have more of a view on, because it's going to affect its production capability. It's going to affect its industrial policy. It's going to affect its ability to become green in the future. So understanding the global order, who's holding the pen in this new global rule book that we are in the process of tearing down right now, we need to have a more concrete view on what China, what is China, what is the ambition of China, what is inevitable about China and what is not inevitable about China, and where does Europe stand in this? The ability to speak with one voice, and I come back now to Germany, is crucial in this respect. Why did Germany change tack? And I will give you a view, and perhaps you can challenge this. Why did Germany change tack with the New Generation EU? Why was there such a big difference there? And my view is that I think Germany has really wanted to be proactive when it comes down to creating a strong Europe to meet the external challenges. And, I think this is what Germany had to give in to in order to, unite Europe, or at least make one step towards uniting the many things that separate us, and therefore have a much more of a consented view that will help us deal with global challenges. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I'd be delighted to hear your views on this.
Great, thanks a lot. I think that external dimension is a very important point. And we have Lukas Guttenberg now, who is Senior Research Fellow and Deputy Head of Research at the Jacques Delors Institute here in Berlin. So I'm sure he can talk about what has changed in the German position and what probably not has changed. Lukas, your turn.
Thanks a lot, Mark, and thanks a lot, Thomas, for putting this together and for inviting me. Actually, I would like to challenge a bit what Maria just said, because I don't think the German position on Eurozone matters has fundamentally changed with the recovery instrument. When we look at what has characterized the German position over the last years, basically since Maastricht, there were three characteristics. The first was that a dominance of federalism by exception, so the idea that there shouldn't be federal permanent institutions at the Eurozone level that would get a life of their own and that would, in a way, work in a preventive measure or a way to deal, for example, with macroeconomic imbalances or with fiscal policy, but that we basically only have the ECB as a federal institution, and then we have institutions like the ESM, which are only there in a crisis and can only be triggered with a very high hurdle. I think when the recovery instrument is basically the same. We have it as a one-off that comes in this crisis that will go away, and that legally it is very clear that this is not a permanent feature. The second feature of the German position had always been a strong level of intergovernmental control. And that is again true also for Next Generation EU. There could have been legal ways of, for example, allowing the EU to borrow in a less invasive manner, but we have that now, and I have to get technical for a second here, in the own resources decision, which means that all parliaments will have to agree to this, all parliaments will have to agree to change the way the EU can borrow in the future. And that means the hurdles are again very, very high, and it's a pretty intergovernmental setup that we see also for the recovery instrument. And I think the third feature that we have always seen in the past is a pragmatism in the choice of instruments. Germany has never been very, very strict on the choice of instruments, but it went always as far as it had to solve the problem of the day. And I think there was a realization in Berlin in the spring that loans wouldn't cut it this time, that we would need some form of transfer. And borrowing now at the EU level is just much, much cheaper than outright transfers to the hardest hit countries. And I think that's why it makes a lot of sense to go this way from a German perspective. But so I think the German position has evolved in the face of the pandemic, and no doubt that was very important and it could have gone another way. But it's not a paradigmatic shift. It's really an evolution of the same position. And I think that also means we have a very open question where Germany stands on a lot of structural Eurozone issues that are still unresolved. And let me just add three here. The first one is the fiscal rules. Kim Fuß already alluded to that. We will have to come to a political consensus after this crisis. How do we apply the fiscal rules, in particular in the face of very high debt in a lot of member states? This debate is not foremost a technical question about like the structural deficit or something, but is really a question of a political consensus, and this will be intimately linked to the German debate on the debt brake. And I think there's absolutely no consensus within Germany on this, and so the German position on this at the European level is very unclear. The second thing I wanted to highlight is banking union. This might become relevant sooner than later, and I think the German side has so far never really embraced the premise behind banking union, which is we want a European banking system. That could be seen very transparently in the Commerzbank Deutsche Bank saga, but it has also not really embraced the rules of banking union. If you only look at NordLB, where things were done in a way that at least were not completely in line with the spirit of European rules, and we might have to face a judgment call very soon whether the European rules on banking union are really applied, and whether we then also use European money to shore up banks in different member states. And the third part is, of course, the question of the Hamiltonian moment. Do we get to a more permanent fiscal policy at European level? I think the finance minister, Olaf Scholz, has called on this for this repeatedly, but of course, Next Generation EU is not that Hamiltonian moment because it's not a permanent feature. And I think also on this question, it's very, very open. Just to conclude, there are a few signs that make me hopeful that we could see a structural shift in the German position on some of these questions. First, public opinion has been very, very favorable to the German position now on Next Generation EU. For the first time, the CDU, which is by far the most important veto player in the German debate on Eurozone issues, has embraced a step at the European level wholeheartedly, full on, and not like the ESM grudgingly with a lot of doubts. And I think that shows in the polls. Like, it hasn't hurt the CDU and it hasn't shifted public opinion to become more skeptical on these issues. And a lot of it will depend on how well Next Generation EU will work. But I think that's a very, very positive step. The second part is that I think it's clear to everyone that we cannot over-rely on the ECB forever. But this is part of the German strategy, or like a central part of the German strategy and German position so far. And I think that is, in a way, it's bad that it had to come to this point, but I think it's encouraging that we see the debate shifting. And finally, I hope that the elections next year could be a moment where we get a debate on European issues before a federal election. Olaf Scholz has said he wants to put this central in the campaign. I'm very curious what that means in terms of substance, but at least to have a debate on this in an election campaign would be very good, because last time what we saw is a strong coalition agreement on Europe without an electoral mandate beforehand. And maybe it could be the other way around. And then we would have a government that actually has a mandate on Europe. And we then have a French president in 2022 who hopefully also has a pro-European agenda. And that could perhaps provide a moment to solve some of these more structural Eurozone institutional architecture questions that Clemens Fuß already alluded to.
Thank you, Lucas, for your thoughts there. There's, of course, a saying by the German philosopher Hegel that at a certain point, a change in quantity becomes a change in quality. And I think it's probably for the debate later on. I find it interesting whether we are at that point in Germany, on which we just keep on adding incremental step by incremental step, but it's certainly maybe we are still in another game. I now like to call on Philippe Legrand. He is a consultant and writer and has been an advisor to the European Commission and the WTO, among other institutions. I can't see you at the moment, Philippe. Are you here?
I am here.
Yeah, floor is yours.
I'm also a senior visiting fellow at the European Institute at London School of Economics. I've often been very critical of the German policy establishment, so I want to start by acknowledging the constructive steps that the German government has taken to support the Eurozone this year, whether it is suspending the application of the Stability and Growth Pact rules, whether it's the massive fiscal stimulus which benefits demand both in Germany and its trading partners, and of course, crucially, the agreement between Chancellor Merkel and President Macron that led to the Franco-German agreement that forms the basis for the Recovery and Resilience Fund. But as I've written in Project Syndicate, while that is a welcome step forward, the Eurozone's fundamental problems remain very much unresolved, and they include Italy's unsustainable debt dynamics, Germany's deflationary bias, and the lack of a fiscal rebalancing mechanism. I think it's important to make the point now that fixing these problems is not solely Germany's responsibility, but it does have a crucial role to play. As George Soros has rightly observed, Chancellor Merkel always does just enough to keep the euro going, but nothing more. If we are to create a more stable and inclusive Eurozone, not one that just hangs together for fear of the costs of falling apart, then Germany needs to be much bolder. And let me briefly touch on three issues: fiscal policy, monetary policy, and imbalances. Now, starting with fiscal policy, at the very least, Germany needs to avoid the mistake that it made a decade ago when it swung prematurely from embracing stimulus to demanding austerity, and not just domestically, but across the Eurozone. I think the Stability and Growth Pact rules need to remain suspended for the foreseeable future. And in the meantime, we need to devise simpler, more flexible, and more growth-friendly rules that act counter-cyclically, not pro-cyclically, and that take account of the policy stance of the Eurozone as a whole. The 60% of GDP debt threshold is completely outdated. The reliance on poorly calculated structural deficits is absurd. and the application of the rules is much, much, much too complicated. If we have to have fiscal rules, they should focus primarily on a simple criterion, like debt interest payments as a percentage of GDP, which is a much better measure of debt sustainability in an era of low interest rates, and which takes account of the interaction between fiscal and monetary policy. Alongside that, I think we need to have steps towards fiscal integration for the reasons given by some of the other speakers. And I'm not convinced by those who say that the Recovery Fund indicates a greater willingness to move towards that. On the contrary, I mean, I agree with Lucas. I mean, it was approved on the basis that it was exceptional, that it was time limited, and with big rebates, of course, for the so-called frugal four. There's also a big political risk that it's going to be badly spent, and that actually it will therefore end up undermining the case of fiscal integration. And of course, it operates at EU level, not Euro level. So I think German support, wherever it comes from on the political spectrum, for a permanent and significant Eurozone budget with debt issuing capacity, along the lines suggested by President Macron, is absolutely crucial. And if we have the frugal 2 or frugal 3 Euro members not wishing to participate, then let it proceed initially without them. I think my biggest worry is on monetary policy, not so much the position of the German government, but that of the German Constitutional Court, which has challenged the legal basis, not just of the QE program, but also the ECB's ability to backstop the monetary union. Now, of course, we all know the ECB is formally independent. It's not subject to German law, but it does operate within political constraints. And I remember very clearly back in 2012, when I was working with President Barroso, it's absolutely inconceivable that Mario Draghi could have made his whatever it takes pledge in 2012 had he not secured Angela Merkel's consent beforehand. Which is why, even though the Karlsruhe ruling, recent one, is not binding on the ECB, it can, of course, order the Bundesbank to withdraw from asset purchases. And that threat, in turn, raises the political cost of the ECB of proceeding with measures that the court does not approve of. And that, in turn, may lead the ECB to tie its own hands in unhelpful and dangerous ways. For instance, it could jeopardize the flexibility of the PEP program and indeed its ability to take exceptional measures in future. So if the ECB is to continue to backstop the monetary union, it needs to be able to credibly commit to act in open-ended, potentially unlimited, and yes, disproportionate ways. And things could come to a head, I think, when the PEP program comes to an end. That's now planned for next year. Even more importantly, the reinvestments are supposed to come to an end at the end of 2022. And that is just a few months before Italian elections, which are due no later than May 2023. And given that ECB asset purchases can involve only temporary divergences from the capital key, the ECB is going to have to be selling Italian bonds at that time. And therefore, that's going to be a very dangerous moment for the Eurozone. One last point on imbalances, which has also been touched on. I think it's, and there are positive signs. Germany needs to put its XF savings to good use domestically by investing much more in its future. Hopefully, we can move beyond the debate of the past 10 years of fetishizing no government borrowing and instead invest in the future. Failing that, Germany can do more to invest productively through its companies across the Eurozone, rather than channeling its excess savings into financial speculation through its banks. At a European level, we need to enforce the macroeconomic imbalances procedure. That's a job for the European Commission to do, and it's a job for Germany to abide by. So on those 3 points, fiscal, monetary, and imbalances, there's a lot to do, a crucial role for Germany, but also much more that Germany's European partners need to do too. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Excellent. Thanks for highlighting the challenges that are ahead of us. I'd like now to go over to Antonella Sirati, I can't see. Oh yeah, here you are. Professor at the University of Rome, and where she's working on inflation, wages, and other macro issues. Please go ahead. Now I can see. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. A lot of interesting points have been raised so far. We don't have much time, so I will try to touch on 3 points. That is to say, the vision of the economic, of the functioning of economic systems in behind the rules and institutions in Europe. Should we aim at fiscal transfers, and what is the alternative, and then a few words about the recovery fund. So I quite agree with the pessimism, let's say, of many of those who have spoken before, in the sense that I think it is true that the Europe and the Eurozone particularly is a very fragile construction. One of the reasons, not the only one probably, but one of the reasons of this fragility is, I think, that it has been built on a set of rules and institutions who are, inspired, let's say, by a view of the economy which is false. What is this false view? The view of the economy as something that is capable of adjusting spontaneously to some kind of potential output and equilibrium unemployment, which are supply side determined, so that, fiscal policies must be very moderately counter-cyclical. In fact, we know that they have been designed in such a way which is in fact pro-cyclical. But the idea is that basically the central bank has to intervene only with regard to prices, and for the rest is the, spontaneously somehow the economic system takes care of everything else. So I think this vision should be, I mean, of course, it's being discarded by facts and also by many economic theorists, but this should penetrate the discussion within European institutions and also in Germany. Unfortunately, many positions which we see from outside, let's say, that are being taken by German economists or German politicians, etc., are based on this view of the economy. This has to be discarded. There is no spontaneous tendency to any supply side determined potential output. Demand matters, and it affects what we usually call potential output. So it affects productivity, it affects labor force participation, it affects the capital formation, and so on. And this must be, must become part of the discussion. Otherwise, the rules will be based on these false premises, and rules based on false premises are bound to be either not respected, and this has been the case of France for 10 years, always deficits above what would have been the rules, or they can be extremely damaging, as it has been the case for Greece and for Italy, Spain, and other countries after 2008. Large part of the increase in Italian debt after 2008, or rather I should say after 2010, is due to mistakes, if you like, in the policy prescription from European institutions, okay? Because that caused a huge fall in GDP, and then an increase in the debt to GDP ratio, because initially the central bank did not lower interest rates as everybody else was doing in the world, but increased them right after the financial crisis. So all these caused an increase in debt to GDP ratio in Italy, and I suppose also in other countries. So these rules have to be overcome. What should be the route? Unlike many colleagues and also many politicians, I don't think that the progressive route, I'm not convinced that the progressive route consists in more fiscal transfers. Because across nations, because we are not a federal state. We do not have the political institutions in the first place that characterize a federal state, not in the Eurozone and even less in the wider European Union. And I do understand that German people or people in other countries and their government may be worried about having to, transfer resources to other nations, to other peoples. We see that happening, and this is not nice, perhaps, even within countries. I mean, Catalonia doesn't want to transfer money to Andalusia, and the northern Italy doesn't like to transfer the much money to the southern Italy, and so on. So this is not something that can happen to a large scale in Europe, where people do not speak the same language, do not have the same institution, when there is no unifying political setup with a democratic mandate, political representation, and so on. So I think what should be done, though, is to realize on the part of Germans, governments and people, that in order to avoid large-scale fiscal transfer to other countries, it must be possible for these countries to grow and not to suffer economic, recessions and unemployment and so on, by their own means, in a sense, by using economic policy, macroeconomic policy tools. So it should be, I think one should create a situation in which these countries have a lot more scope for using fiscal policy or industrial policy or regional policies to help reduce the huge divergences that are emerging in Europe. And I think that there are two sides of it. One is to recognize, for example, that instruments such as some form of soft monetization or hard monetization of public debts is not a fiscal transfer and is not inflationary, not in the present context. Okay, this could help, at least keeping very low interest rate, ensuring the continuity of these and rollover of debt would allow countries which have a higher debt to have fiscal space when they need it. I think the rules internal to the Eurozone should be changed, getting rid of potential output denial and all these very troublesome concepts and very fragile concepts, and perhaps go back to an old idea by Okun, which saw the target for macroeconomic policy in a particular unemployment rate, which is reasonable to suppose is the frictional unemployment rate in a given country, say somewhere between 4% and 6% according to economic structure, or this unemployment rate could be regarded as the lowest unemployment rate reached by that country in the last 10 years or something, because this demonstrates that it is feasible for that economy, okay, without high inflation. That should be the target. And until the target is reached, the fiscal policy and perhaps a bit of regional and industrial policy should be allowed to the government of that country. Of course, with some constraint. What should be the constraint? There is a fear that this could lead to inflation. Okay, let's say that this can be done, but only if the country can do that policy without reaching, say, more than 2% inflation rate or something like that. Another constraint that is a real objective constraint is the external balance. So import should not exceed exports for more than something or for more than a certain period and so on. So there could be a revision of macroeconomic rules which leave more scope to individual countries for pursuing something close to full employment and improvement in the growth performance, more productivity, etc. having the fiscal space to do it. Otherwise, it's a vicious circle for countries which don't have it. Some of the divergence after the pandemic is caused by the fact that Spain and Italy, although very badly hit by the virus, have spent much less than Germany in facing the pandemic, because they are afraid, as what was said, there are uncertainties about the continuity of monetary policy. We don't know whether and how fiscal rules in Europe will be reintroduced and so on. So I think these uncertainties must be removed. The last point is the recovery fund. I think the recovery fund is a very good thing, not because it involves much of fiscal transfers. Italy, I did some, calculations. In the end, if the sum is entirely given to Italy according to the rules which are now designed, the proper transfer would be 30 billions overall. All the rest, loans, will be returned, and also a large part of the so-called grants, in fact, will be financed by a contribution by Italy as well. So it's not good because it involves a lot of fiscal transfers. Not much, particularly if one considers that Italy, for example, has been a net contributor to the budget, European budget. What is important is the tool, the possibility of having a common debt at low interest rate, very long maturity. Very long maturity, I think, is a very important key, so that you can spend now when it's needed, a deep recession, and then return in a very, very slowly, very gradually, in a far future when hopefully GDP will have increased, prices will have increased, and so the weight of the debt will be much less important. So I think it's a very useful tool. This kind of things should be encouraged, because they allow to do things that have a macroeconomic impact, and at the same time do not involve much of fiscal transfers. Okay, so they can be accepted. And I think that of course, the recovery fund is useful macroeconomically if it doesn't go along with the introduction of the usual fiscal rules that would impose cuts in the national budget for other entities. And so it is very important that we do not return to the old fiscal rules, and that the idea behind the recovery fund might be extended, for example, for creating infrastructure of European interest. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure we come back to the issue of how to change the rules and make them more suitable for the situation. Now, last but certainly not least, Martin Wolf, chief economics commentator at the Financial Times and one of the most influential economics journalists on the globe, I would say. Martin, please. We can't hear you. Is your microphone on?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. It should now work. Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I apologize. So I have been the victim of what I have often referred to as a particularly vicious form of discrimination that nobody worries about, which is alphabeticism. So I'm nearly always last in a group like this. And this means inevitably that everything possible has already been said. So all I can do is repeat it or argue with it. I think I'm probably going to repeat it more than argue with it, but that is the pain of having a large panel and being last. Okay, I'm going to make a few fundamental points, and they're quite simple, not, I think, terribly technical. There's been quite a lot of technical discussion, and I think we need to think about this in a much bigger way than economists are doing. I'm in the middle of, well, I'm virtually at the end of writing a book called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And one of its conclusions is that economics as a profession is a catastrophe. And I mean that with absolute seriousness. It's not an unadulterated catastrophe, but it's an almost unadulterated catastrophe when it gets into political domains. which don't work on the same logic. Now, my points here is I thought 30 years ago that the euro was at the very least a huge gamble and probably a big mistake. It needed, in my view, a political union to operate, a view which I think most Germans held and which I agreed with then and agree with now. And the fact that this was impossible would make it very difficult to operate. And I believe that subsequently proved to be true. However, it has also proved essentially irreversible. And this, and for other reasons, means that it must be made to succeed. By the way, I also argued in the 1990s that if we didn't join, the UK did not join, we would end up leaving the EU. And I turned out to be right on that too. So it took 20 years for that to be proved true. So that's the first main point. This is an incredibly difficult challenge to make this work among, as has been pointed out by previous speakers, such vastly different countries, culturally, politically, socially, and economically. But it has to be. Second point, I believe the health of the Eurozone, which hasn't been really discussed here, but presumably in other panels, is an existential issue for Germany, given its scale, its location, its size, uncomfortably small to be a superpower and uncomfortably large to be a small country, and its centrality, of course, in Europe. And there are four specific challenges of the moment which make the survival and success of the Eurozone as the core project of the European Union absolutely central to German interests. First, the obvious dissolution of the West as a political idea. And I don't think Biden will reverse it, though I think he might attenuate it. Secondly, the transformative significance of the rise of China as a superpower. Third, the ongoing, and in my view, probably irreversible breakdown of important aspects of globalization. And fourth, the challenge of managing the global environment and the global commons. It was because of these challenges that I thought Britain's decision was particularly insane. But it means that Germany must make the Eurozone succeed. The third point, since the Eurozone has to succeed, Germany as the continent's leading power must do and think whatever it takes to ensure it does so. And that means fourth, and this is where I will elaborate a little bit more, Germany has to get rid of a whole slew of thinking which worked beautifully for Germany as what I think of as the largest small open economy in the world before the Eurozone was created, into being part of what is not a small open economy. Now, this has many dimensions, but I think the most important was the idea that the natural, and I think this fits very well with what the previous speaker said, but I'm saying it in a slightly different way, which is the idea that the right way to do macroeconomic adjustment, which really meant economic adjustment, is by avoiding any form of vile Keynesian macroeconomic policy and relying on supply side adjustment via the external account, with monetary policy supporting normally in a pro-cyclical way, principally through the exchange rate. That was a brilliant system for post-war Germany. It is completely unworkable for the Eurozone. The Eurozone is a large closed economy. That's sort of a long-term structural condition. It has to have a demand policy as the US has, or as China, of course, has, without even thinking about it. And worse, right at the moment, we're in a situation of global chronically deficient demand, as shown in the extraordinarily low interest rates of the past 12 years and the unbelievably low rates of today across the entire yield curve, nominal and real, which means monetary policy is not fully effective. I think history is relevant in considering this. It is true that in the early 2000s, Germany adjusted its macroeconomy with enormous success through its classic model via wage suppression and the external count, generating a massive surplus. Unfortunately, that also generated endogenous bubbles in other Eurozone countries, which blew up in the financial crisis. After the global financial crisis, essentially the same classic German model was used, but this time by the Eurozone as a whole, every member of which, with the exception of France, is now in a current account surplus. This imposed massive slumps on many member countries from which they have, in considerable measure, failed to emerge ever since, even before COVID-19. This simply cannot happen again. The external demand is not there, as has been pointed out, and it will blow up, in my view, Eurozone politics in at least one member state, if not more. Just look at the attitudes people have to the EU as shown in polls. Italy is a very classic example. Do not underestimate the power of populist politics. It can blow it all up. Just look what's happening in the US. We won't go into there. So there has to be a demand and growth policy for the Eurozone. Monetary policy, of course, has a large role to play. This has been discussed, but it has limits in current circumstances. There has to be a Eurozone-wide fiscal policy, whether it's done through national means or Eurozone level means, I don't really care, some combination, but it's the only way for a grown-up currency union to operate. And of course, as part of this, as Philippe has mentioned, Germany has to eliminate a large part of its current account surplus. The counterpart deficits will not be run stably anywhere. They will not be run stably anywhere. What do you think Mr. Trump's trade policy is about? And of course, COVID-19 has made this all more urgent. So that's sort of where Germany has to rethink. The crucial point I'm making is the economic and political health of Eurozone member countries has, as a result of the decision to join the monetary union, may become a primary domestic matter for Germany. It's a primary domestic matter for Germany. So there must either be a move towards a fuller political union or some other way of internalizing all the relevant externalities within the politics of the member states, and particularly in Germany. And if that doesn't happen, given the enormous challenges which Clement rightly described at the beginning of his contribution and the other contributions that the Eurozone and all the developed countries now face, certainly dramatically my own country, I am very concerned about the future.
Thank you, Martin. There's, of course, one advantage of coming last is that you can set the tone for the debate. And in this sense, I would like to kick off the debate sticking to the bigger picture with a provocative thought, perhaps, that if I look around in the world, I see the US, which has a lot of problems at the moment in terms of political stability, also economic instability, social instabilities. Then there's China, the other big area, which also has its own problems with a tendency towards authoritarianism and sort of the idea of just you can paper over these divergences, but just by surveying people. And then I look at Europe, which has problems, but a social model which probably is more inclusive than the US model. With institutions that might be weak, but they're developing. I mean, stuff keeps being added. So is it actually true that are we bound to be the losers in Europe on the world scale? So it's now open for everyone. Just if you want to say something, just say it.
Let me just respond very quickly since it's replied to me. I think the answer is absolutely no. I agree with you completely. I believe passionately in European civilization. And I want it to succeed and thrive. And your starting point is correct. But I don't think you can assume that it will last indefinitely. The thing I've learned most clearly in the last 20 years is that complacency about the stability of social and political arrangements is very dangerous. None of us, I think, 20 years ago thought the US or UK would go the way they have. And if I look around Europe today, Germany is a model, of course, in this regard, but it's not on its own in Europe. And there are plenty of countries with enormous stresses upon them. So I wouldn't I just would warn against being complacent.
Anyone else? Yeah, Maria?
Yeah, I mean, just if I can add maybe a couple of thoughts on this. I think for the moment, at least, it feels very much like Europe is the continent to conquer, in the sense that the US is trying to push the EU to do something, and China is very much involved actually in trying to sort of understand whether this is a playing field for China. And Europe is actually very passive when it comes to this. It doesn't have an active role to play. It is, what is it that we want? What is the end game in globalization? Where do we want to be in that system of multilateral governance? And what is that globalization going to look like? And this is my second point. I mean, you know, it's not obvious to me, you know, what the global multilateral system will look like and how Europe can contribute to that. Can you envisage in, let's say, 100 years from now, where is the role of, where is the center of gravity in the global scene? If you look at just population trends, you know, that's inevitably is going to be in the East. So, you know, the Western model, as somebody called it, I mean, where is this Western model and what can Europe achieve with that? And that has got implications about, are we going to trade with each other the way that we trade today? Can we still benefit from open trade, but also in a more sort of distribution, well-distribution aspects of trade? It's not obvious to me what the end game is going to be, and therefore it's not obvious to me how can we design today to get there. But I mean, I think that this is something that Europe needs to be a bit proactive on. If you are a big supporter of multilateralism, open trade, as indeed, you know, Brussels as sort of the one voice for Europe when it comes to issues of trade, multilateralism, free trade. Well, how are we going to achieve that in a model which is actually extremely polarized?
Maybe to follow up then, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Just an observation of you. I'm not sure about, I really find very difficult to make predictions for the future. So I don't know if we are going to be the losers, but certainly the Eurozone has been the loser in the past years, in the sense that we have grown much less than other areas in the world, than the US and other parts of the world. So again, this goes back to the point I made about wrong premises of macroeconomic policies, because even if Germany is a success case, even Germany has grown less than Sweden, let's say. So there is something that has to be changed in the macroeconomic policy of the Eurozone.
Philip?
Yeah, I think building on what Martin has said, I mean, the context in which the EU and the Eurozone have developed over the past 30 years is over. The era of globalization underpinned by US hegemony, where basically the EU could act as if geopolitics doesn't matter, and indeed dream that the EU system was going to be applied globally. That is over. And there's a reevaluation of that you can see in trade policy, where the EU does have the means to act. There is a reevaluation of that to a certain extent in investment policy. There certainly isn't the means to do that in the crucial financial sphere. And I think that has to be a key argument, I think, in Germany and elsewhere, about the need for creating a common Eurozone asset and common and large, deep Eurozone or wide capital markets to give the Eurozone the strategic autonomy that it needs in this area. And last but not least, because we are talking big picture, in security and defense. And if you have big players such as the US and China willing to use security issues as a geoeconomic weapon, if you have an economic pygmy like Russia willing to use security to achieve its interests, then the Europe needs to be able to do that too. And of course, that creates huge challenges, not least for Germany, which has been a free rider on Western security for so long, and where, for obvious historical reasons, there are deep qualms about being more proactive in security terms. But I think if there's room for a grand bargain, and I've written this before, it should be that France share with Germany its nuclear deterrence system in exchange for Germany agreeing to the creation of a common Eurozone budget. And that, I think, is the basis for creating a broader European integration system.
We have talked about macro policy or demand policy, as Martin has called it, as one of the necessary conditions for this more sovereign Europe in that new world of different blocks, geopolitical blocks. I'd like to bring in Clemens Fuß now. Would you agree that the old system and the old rules don't work anymore, and we need to we need to get a new system of fiscal policy management on the European level? Your micro is not on?
Yes, yeah. No, it should be on. No, I do agree we need a different framework. I don't think that macroeconomic policies were the main reason for the miseries we have in Europe. We have macroeconomic policies are one part, but we have massive problems in structural policies as well. If I look at Italy as an outsider, I mean, 25 years of low growth cannot be explained by macroeconomic policy problems only. That's obvious. So I think it's a whole mixture of problems here. But I totally agree. The current setup is not conducive to macroeconomic stabilization. I think we need a central fund, not the one Macron proposed, but we need a fund that is available in big crises. If we had had this now, we would have a much better setup than we currently have. I think the Next Generation EU Fund is a good thing. It will stabilize expectations, but it has cost a lot of political capital. Now, if this goes wrong, if the recovery goes wrong, I don't have the slightest doubt that the Frugal Four, maybe also parts of the German political establishment, will say, look, we gave a lot of money. Germany gives 60 billion euros. That's a lot of money. If you look at it, in some ways, it's also not very much money. But people will say, look, we gave a lot of money and it didn't work. So I think this is a huge risk. And this takes me to Philippe's point. We always return to this issue that we do not, and I firmly believe we need the political legitimacy or more common policies. And the way towards that will have to be some kind of constitutional deal, changing the institutional framework in Europe more towards a federal structure, willingness of France to share its nuclear arms. And that is the condition, in my view, for Germany to be willing to share or to move towards more solidarity financially. It makes no sense at all for Germany to do this without institutional changes and without getting something in return. So I think common security policies, including common nuclear armament, it would be a very important step. Many of our problems are related to that. If we just discussed the ECB ruling of the German Constitutional Court, it was, I'm not a lawyer, but it was completely logical. The EU is not a federation. There is no federal layer where we have a court that says what the federal government do and can't do. The sovereignty of the EU rests on the member states. And if the EU or EU institutions overstep their mandate, the national constitutional courts act. That's at least how the national courts see it, and it's perfectly logical. I'm aware that it creates a lot of, as I think Maria said, it creates uncertainty. Of course it does, but the European, the Constitutional Court had to act given its understanding of the entire judicial setup. There's no doubt about that. So I think we need to start with a constitutional reform. What we're seeing a lot of in Europe is say, okay, we don't have the institutions, we don't have the legitimacy. We have a rule saying there is no monetary financing of government deficits. It's the basis of the contract. We have a no bailout rule. This was the contract we signed when we created this Eurozone. It was a condition for Germany to join. Of course, you can say it's a stupid contract, but that's what the rules are. And I think we need to change the rules first. We cannot change, what we do and then be disappointed when the courts say what you're doing is undemocratic, it's wrong. We need to change the constitutional framework, and once we've done that, I think we can make progress. I agree with Martin's fundamental point. We're stuck in the Eurozone in a very uncomfortable situation, but we need to address that. We cannot get around that.
Lucas, did you want? Yeah, go ahead.
On this point, I think political union will never come with a big flag where it says we are now in political union. Political union is, I think, a state that we reach at the point where debates at the European level are in a way politicized, that cater for some real democratic debate on policy questions. And I'm not sure we are not there yet. I think that the whole debate we have now on the recovery fund has shown, we have a capacity to act, which is really fast at the European level if we need to. And I think the debates we will see in the next year over how this money will be spent will be crucial to see whether we have now a European debate space for how this money is used and what kind of reforms and investment that will finance at the national level. And we have proposed in the summer to get the European Parliament more involved in this, and I think it's an imperfect process. But I think that is a point where we get much closer to what we would call a political union. And I'm also not sure whether we really need a constitutional reform, as Clemens put it, which would mean completely overhaul the institutions. I think our main problem in the last years has been with policy outcomes rather than with the lacking institutional structure to decide things. We can discuss about the areas where we need to move away from unanimity, but truth be told, we have a lot of areas where we can already decide with qualified majority. I think if we have to change something, it's the question about the financial resources we have at the European level. But I think in theory, we have the institutions to decide on that. We have a European Parliament that already can decide on the European budget. And I have no doubt that if the Parliament would have more power in certain areas, it would also get better people for these areas, as we see in the areas where there are already legislative files. So I'm not sure it's really about the institutions. I think it's about having a political discourse at the European level and about changing policy outcomes.
I'd like to talk a little about this point, though, that do we agree here on this panel that we need a change of the basic contract of the Constitution in order to get to the policies we agree that are needed, or do we think it can be done, as Lucas has said, on a more incremental level? You know, we can just muddle our way through and to reach that point. What are the opinions? Yeah.
Okay, first thing, sorry, I would like to react to the idea of structural problems and Italy not growing for 25 years. Just some pieces of statistical information. Up to the beginning of the 90s, the rate of growth of GDP and productivity in Italy was on average extremely close to those of Germany, was the same. So then there was an extremely abrupt change, right, say between 93 and 95, in both trends, productivity and GDP. What happened? So it must have been something happening in those years, because it has been an abrupt change in trends. And what happened in those years are several things, most of which are related to the creation of the Eurozone, or going towards the creation of the Eurozone. The first thing is, since the beginning of the 90s, Italy always ran a surplus in primary public budget for 30 years. This has slowed up growth terribly, okay? Then also productivity growth depends very much on GDP growth. This is again something that everybody now tends to recognize, most economists tend to recognize. So the two things are not unrelated, with a causal link that goes to a large extent, at least, from GDP growth to productivity and not vice versa. This is the old Caldorian idea of, or Verdorn idea, and there is a lot of literature on that. The second thing that happened is that we had the reform of wage fixing that increased the, sort of further lowered the wage share, which also is not completely, unrelated to European policies. We had finally fixed the exchange rate, which was probably not the correct one for Italy, which also discouraged, let's say, or diminished the potentialities in terms of exports and increased imports. So there were a number of changes in income distribution, macroeconomic policy, exchange rate, which are not unrelated. And also there were a lot of privatization of public firms, some of which were very strong in research and development, in new technologies, etc. So these things, however, are not related to the European framework. The other thing about the graduality or not, I don't know, but of course, reforming the rules in Europe takes a lot of time because there is no agreement and is a very long process. In the meantime, if we don't have the appropriate monetary policy, the Eurozone simply will break up. So one has to decide what if you want the euro or you don't want it. If you want it, probably the change in policy has to be fast, while the change in rules, unfortunately, is often very slow. This is another problem with the European construction. The decisions are very slow, but often the reality requires that decisions are fast. So it's a problem.
Yeah, on the other hand, if I look at the US and the budget debates and the fights there, they're always also not always the quickest in terms of taking decisions. So maybe that's also just a feature of politics in a large federation or even in a large single monolithic states where you have a land or states that want to interfere. On the sorry, yeah.
I was just going to pick up on this US-Europe, because I have a view which is sort of split down the middle between the two views taken here, whether we need absolutely fundamental reform or things can be left as they are, as it were. I argued in a piece, which Clemens must have really hated it, but never mind. If you allow the ECB to do what it's now doing, which is, and I quote from somebody at a high level at the ECB, but I won't say who it is, of course, to act as the central bank, the national central bank of each member, then, which of course the Fed doesn't have to do, because it can deal with federal assets. So that's a crucial difference, right? You could imagine the Fed, if there was no federal government with federal debt and Hamilton never existed, that the Fed was acting to buy the debt of every state. And you could imagine that, but the US doesn't have to do this. The ECB does. If you allow the central bank to intervene in this way in a crisis, and a crisis situation can be defined generously, and it can do so on an enormous scale, and if you additionally add the sort of fund that you've just produced and make it effective, then you have gone quite a long way to make the system work in a crisis, quite a long way. And I was very appreciative. But of course, Clement can rightly say that this is pushing, to put it mildly, the limits of the contract. And I'm putting it very mildly, so I'm not surprised by the German reaction. So my point would be, yes, you can make this operate, but you can only do so by acting arguably ultra vires. That's a very uncomfortable situation to be in the long run, which is why I tend to think that in the long run, Clement is right. There has to be a constitutional settlement.
Clemens first.
If I may add to this, what Martin just said, and also to what Lucas said, of course, I'm not naive. I don't think there's going to be a big institutional reform tomorrow. And in some way, I think that what Martin just describes is really what's going on. If at the beginning of this debate, we discussed, why did the German government suddenly support this fund rather than making a lot of fuss? Now, my understanding is that there has finally been an awareness in the German government that the crisis will go as follows. Now, if Germany insists on hard budget constraints and all the rules, what will happen is at some point a crisis will come. A country like Greece will face exit from the Eurozone, and then irrespective of whether it is a good idea or a bad idea that the country leaves the Eurozone, the German government will say, oh, this is highly unattractive. As it said in 2013, it's highly unattractive to have a big short-term crisis for maybe, long-term benefit or long-term damage or whatever it is. So it is cheaper to not even let it get there and to prevent it in the first place. I think that was what, in a way, a lesson from the first crisis. So if you insist on these rules, you have to be ready to go through with it. And in some ways, that's the decision between facing a massive common pool problem, which we face, of course, in Europe. Martin just described it. It's not just breaking contract. Economically, we are facing a massive common pool problem. If everybody can call the ECB and say, hey, can you print me some money? I need some money. This is an absurd situation. It's a massive common pool problem. So this can only work if there is an implicit understanding, not strict rules. There must be some kind of implicit understanding. Okay, we will do this, but we will not exaggerate. At some point, we will all, protect our common currency. And my impression is, that is the kind of equilibrium we're in now, a bit fragile. But you could argue, it's not so bad. It breaches the law. Our lawyer friends will not like it. It is not legitimate, but, it's acceptable for everybody. It's pragmatic.
And if it's acceptable, maybe it's also legitimate in some ways. I mean, there are different sources of legitimacy, and the law is only one source. It has to be interpreted.
You can discuss that with the lawyers.
Yeah, with the lawyers.
Good luck.
Also on this point, so Martin raised two conditions. So the ECB does what is necessary, and there's some sort of European-wide fund, right? I want to talk about the national budget rules, right? Is it necessary in order to get to that stability without the big grand bargain, to get to that stability to also reform national budget rules? So do we have to get rid of the 60%? Does it have to be 90%? Do we have to get rid of it altogether? Or would that be then the overdoing it, as Clemens has just mentioned, if we change the Growth and Stability Pact?
Nobody's going to pay any attention to them, in my view. They're dead. I don't know what Clemens thinks. I think they're dead.
Yeah, I think, I agree. I think it hasn't been, people keep saying, okay, we had to cut the deficit in 2013 because there were the rules. Nobody, and even in 2013, nobody cared about the rules. I think that's simply wrong. The EU didn't force anybody to cut budget deficits. It was more a matter of, maybe a matter of a conflict with Brussels, making the capital markets unhappy. That was more it. But and I think now at the moment, people are taking it seriously even less. I would be in favor of having a discussion, reforming it. But what we should absolutely do is stick to national budget rules, just because we need a commitment to solid public finances. If we abolish this all, my fear would be that investors will lose confidence. So I think we need a long-term commitment to, protecting the ECB from, being dominated by fiscal policy. And I wouldn't be against, sitting down. It cannot be made worse. There's nothing left of these rules, and it cannot be made worse. So why not try to make it a little more credible?
Clement, every central bank is dominated by fiscal. It has suffering for fiscal dominance. There's no European problem.
Contrary to what Clemens said, there was huge pressure on national governments, and that came from the ECB playing trespassing actually into that role and saying, well, unless you impose massive pro-cyclical austerity, we're not going to act to quell the panic in bond markets, and ultimately the ECB blinked in 2012 because it realized that that would be the end of the Eurozone unless it did intervene, and Draghi had the acquiescence of Merkel by that stage to do it. But the idea that there wasn't, it was purely a capital markets thing, and it was just, there was no pressure at all on national governments, it simply, it isn't true.
No, it wasn't coming from the fiscal rules, I agree. It wasn't coming, I mean, the ECB wants to protect itself, I agree. And they put pressure, but it's not the fiscal rules, you know, the 3% rule.
It's a capital markets, absolutely. And the ECB is working very hard to kill that. Of course.
Yeah, I agree. Lucas, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I would agree with Clemens to the extent that I don't think any particular Commission decision had a particularly strong impact on budget in the member states. But of course, there was a political consensus in 2011, 2012 that was very much in favor of fiscal consolidation. And I think that is the question, like what kind of political consensus do we get in the Eurozone after the crisis? And to come back to my earlier point, I did want to say that like everything is fine in the Eurozone, but I think it's a question fundamentally of majorities among member states and even in the European Parliament for the one or the other political outcome. And I think that's why the German position is so important. And we saw when France and Germany have a common position that both sides really support and really are after, then that makes a huge difference, even within the current political institution, with the current institution setup, then a lot of things are possible. And I think that's true for the fiscal rules, and that's true for a potential common fiscal policy further down the road. And so this is what I meant with, like, it's about the policy outcomes much more than about the institutional or constitutional structure.
Yeah, but aren't we then back at the question of legitimacy, right? I mean, if what Martin says is right, that every central bank is ultimately controlled or dominated by its state, then probably it's more difficult to accept that for Germans in this case, if the central bank is not the Bundesbank, but the European Central Bank, and it's dominated by the Italian state and not by the German state. So in a way, you know, is it a problem of this strange thing that the euro area actually is, which is composed of different member states with different national loyalties and so on. And so a lot of stuff which is easy in a national context is a lot more difficult in the European context, politically. And
absolutely. I mean, if it's your own central bank, you don't have a problem. I mean, the Bundesbank would always have bailed out, I completely agree, the German government, of course. It was independent, but it would always have bailed out the German government. But the ECB cannot do that unless we want to create a massive common pool problem, and that's our difficulty. So, I mean, here is a suggestion. I mean, in this current situation, without the big institutional reform, if we look at the coming years, one way forward would be to say, okay, let's implicitly agree on forgetting about budgetary roles for a moment and focus more on spending paths. So we all agree, okay, to get back to growth, we need reasonable public investment. We don't want to cut back public spending overly, but we should have a debate in Europe about how the spending paths are going, and also about public investment. One big disappointment could be that the Next Generation EU isn't used to increase public investment. I think that shouldn't happen. So if we had a debate on public spending and not so much on public debt for a limited amount of time, and that might be a way forward. And then when the economy recovers, because I mean that has to be the objective, capital markets believing that the debt ratios will go down in the medium term, that the debt will be serviced, and growth somehow coming back. And to achieve that, I think we need a long-term commitment to fiscal solidity, but an interim time for the recovery where we focus more on spending.
Yeah, Maria, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to go back to the rationale behind the fiscal rules, I mean, I think there is no doubt that these rules just don't work. But the rationale for the rules was the need for coordination, not only for fiscal coordination, but at some point to have a fiscal monetary coordination. Now, we don't have the fiscal monetary coordination because we don't have the sovereign the status at the EU. But at least on the fiscal side, there was a good reason why we had those rules in the Maastricht sense. It's important that one country doesn't put other countries and the whole union at peril. I mean, that rationale surely hasn't gone. if anything, is reinforced. I mean, now the question is, how do you achieve that? If you don't want to achieve that through some other rules, you could do it through the investment discussions that we can have that Clemens just talked about. But the fact remains that this conversation will always be liable to the political cycle. And political cycles in Europe are not synchronized. I mean, they go in different ways and they react to different things. So we will meet this problem ahead of us. I think it's important not to lose kind of the woods from the forest here, that the uncoordinated fiscal policies will always be a danger for the project. And the question is, how do you coordinate best to allow for growth, but at the same time not impose rules that are simply not good?
Yeah. Okay. If there are no more comments, I would like to thank you for that stimulating and deep debate. I learned a lot. I hope you also learned something. It was a pleasure to chair this panel. And I'll hand over to Thomas right now for closing remarks, I guess. Thomas?
Yes, thanks a lot, Mark, for this moderation and this excellent panel. Very much appreciated. Let me just use the last couple of minutes to sum up a little bit what we've been doing. The objective of this workshop over 3 days in the end has been to discuss what are the big challenges for Germany and what are maybe the first answers to having a new model, another model, a better model of the German economy, in search of a new paradigm. That's the guiding idea that we have in mind that seems to be needed. And all that just some days before the 30th anniversary of unification, which we'll have on Saturday, which allowed us to ask the question, in the historical question, is there a need of a renewal of capitalism, which seems in a question that is not completely out of the range, at least as we looked at the numbers from a poll that we did with Forza, where it seemed where only not even 10% of Germans say we're okay with our economic system as it is, and there seems to be a lot of issues that we have to address. We had a lot of really big highlights, and I'm quite happy with that. I mean, it's probably not so often that Joe Stiglitz is discussing with an acting finance minister, at least not with a German one. That has probably been the first one for a long time. And having Olaf Scholz yesterday to discuss at a day when he presented his budget at the Bundestag was something which we very much appreciated, and that an acting German finance minister openly discusses in English with a Nobel Prize laureate like Joe Stiglitz was a real highlight and very inspiring. As well as Thomas Piketty, who has highlighted the German innovation side, social innovations in Germany, contrary to what international perception of Germany, of the very German, of a more conservative German policy is. We had a talk with, I was talking with Jens Spahn, one of the leading figures of the CDU, of German conservatives, signaling very clearly that he also sees a need for renewal of the understanding of what the state has to do and not to do, and something which touches social issues and globalization he's talking about. So that seems to enter this, I mean, what we're talking about, the new paradigm, is entering also parties that doesn't seem to be at the forefront of such thinking. We had not only these big figures, but also very excellent inputs, allowing us to go forward in better understanding what could be the new economic model, or another better economic model. We had an excellent paper and an excellent discussion on the role of housing in inequality in Germany, which seems to be crucial, and a very important insight for us to go and find the real efficient answers of how to cope and how to handle inequality questions in a broader sense, not only in income terms, but also in wealth terms and chances and so on. We had an excellent input with some very concrete ideas from Michael Hüter and Jens Südekom on how to reform Germany's fiscal policy, very concretely, with some ideas of reforming the debt brake, which is work in progress. Both will work on it in the next few days and weeks and introduce insights from the discussion yesterday. We had a real important, I think a very important input from Mariana Mazzucati and her team as sort of a blueprint on how to make climate policies much more consistently part of a coherent economic policy and industrial policy, introducing both sides, competitiveness and climate issues, sustainability issues. That's, I think, very promising and also work in progress. And we had some really big insights on the future of the German industry, as well as this discussion we just had on the Eurozone and another discussion this morning on populism. For everyone who couldn't follow these discussions, we will have them all on our website again. You can all follow each of them again. We will have work on these studies because this is really big work that we will continue. We would, for example, have a third stage on inequality, having analyzed the drivers of inequality. Now, next stage will be how to, if we better understand the relative importance of different drivers of inequality, how can we then design an efficient policy that copes with inequality issues? We will have now prepare an agenda, research agenda for 2020, and for anyone who wants to suggest whatever you think will be important for us to take into account, that's the moment to bring in. Next year will be very much under the impression of the German federal election, so that we want to touch the main issues. Inequality might be one, but the Eurozone, the Euro question's another one that we need to address more in this next time. And we want to focus again, that's something we talked about in the morning, on narratives and paradigm shifts, because I think the understanding of these issues, narratives and paradigms, is very crucial to design a better and new policy. Concretely, we will next week have a seminar which will be interesting for you all, I think, and you mentioned the name Hamilton. We have a seminar on the Hamilton moment together with Jakob von Weizsäcker and Agnès Benassi de Curé. So both chief economists, French and German from finance ministries, and some excellent people like Lucas will be there. And you're invited all to join. We will send you invitations also. Which will be a very small, a smaller group of experts discussing, has that been in Hamilton moment, and these questions that we already touched this morning. So thanks for anyone who has contributed to this. We had a big challenge, which was the first real hybrid conference that we did. Maybe what some of you will have touched. For us, it was real new. It's easy to have a presence in-person workshop. I mean, it's not easy, but we know how to do it. We had good experience with only virtual events like the one that we have now, the session that we had now. Having both together is a real challenge. And I have to thank my team, Anne, Tor, Mark, and Julia, for excellent work. I mean, we had already some feedback. You're working on this. You had done a tremendous job. We were on Twitter and YouTube and any channel that you can imagine. And we tried, I mean, there were some problems sometimes to bring in the people online and real, but I think we did it quite okay. Hopefully, we will not need to continue these kinds of exercises forever, but some of these will continue, I think, and it's good. I mean, we spend less time and we can spend more time this way and less in travel. But still, I enjoyed yesterday to have people around and not only on the screens. So that was excellent. I thank again everyone. And as I know that both hopefully are still online, I want to thank the last word, Kajo Koch-Weser and Johannes Meyer, who are both online, as I saw, who have been both the ones that been at the origin and the core of this idea. It is more or less 4 years ago, and it reminds what we had to listen to last night. It was quite immediately after, some days or weeks after the presidential election in the US and Trump election, and it was quite soon, some time after the Brexit vote that we started to think, and Johannes and Kayo very much, to think about the need for such an initiative, to think about a new paradigm and new thinking to cope with this populism. And to conclude, just a word, Martin, I think in most things I'm in line with what you're thinking, except for the euro. I think if you listen to what has happened in the US last night, and you should look at these pictures, until now we're not in the worst shape in Europe. So we have avoided such a catastrophe like the US has, and political and the UK. So maybe it's not all wrong what the Eurozone has done, and maybe we're on the right way to a better world. So thanks a lot, and enjoy the day, and see you soon back again. Thanks to all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.